Long after the rest of the city surrendered to sleep, the streets lay still under a thin veil of moonlight. Every doorway was shut, every shutter latched, every sign swinging gently in the cold breeze, as though exhaling the last traces of the day. Even the stray dogs, so restless in the daylight, curled themselves into quiet corners, waiting for morning to arrive. Only the sound of distant water, slipping along the edge of the town wall, hinted that anything still moved at all. And yet, somewhere among the darkened houses and crooked alleys, one faint glow refused to dim. It pulsed like the smallest heartbeat inside a body, too tired to feel it, flickering stubbornly behind a narrow window stained with soot. Inside that cramped stone room, an alchemist bent over a furnace that had already devoured half the night. He worked in a silence so complete it seemed to breathe with him. His ink-stained fingers hovered above the flames, trembling slightly from exhaustion or anticipation, as he adjusted a small iron grate holding a vessel no larger than a child's bowl. The fire snapped at the base of the metal, threatening to die each time he blinked too slowly. He coaxed it with a patience grown from years of disappointment, feeding it slivers of wood and whispering soft breaths until the embers brightened again. Candles melted in thick drips beside him, their light sliding over glass bottles clouded with age. Parchment papers lined his table, some filled with careful diagrams, others smudged with hurried notes written at hours no sane person would choose. The room smelled of resin, smoke, dried herbs, and something metallic that clung to the tongue. Every object had been touched so many times that it carried the memory of his hands. Cracked cups with darkened rims, spoons bent from repeated heating, quills sharpened until they could barely hold ink. None of it looked like the tools of a grand discovery. Everything seemed fragile, mismatched, almost desperate. Yet the alchemist moved with a reverence that implied he was standing at the edge of something immense, as though one more night might reveal what countless others had failed to show. He paused briefly, wiping a smear of soot from his wrist. In the wavering candlelight, his face appeared older than his years, shaped by nights spent chasing ideas no one else believed existed. He had no students to carry on his work, no wealthy patron to demand results, no neighbors who understood why he walked through town with the same faraway gaze every morning. His world was contained within these walls, thick with dust and dreamlike shadows. And yet he kept going, driven by the fragile conviction that there must be an answer hidden somewhere in the layers of smoke, flame, and time. Outside his window, the world suffered under sickness, hunger, and the slow decay that frightened even the bravest. He had watched plague carts rattle through the square. He had seen families vanish behind shuttered doors. He had heard of wars grinding across distant fields, leaving villages burned to ash. To many, these were signs of a world unraveling, but to him, they were reminders that the old ways had reached their limits. Something deeper was needed, something bold enough to push against fate itself. And so each night, he returned to his furnace, believing that he might find the knowledge capable of reshaping the broken patterns of existence. His eyes drifted to a manuscript lying open on the table, its pages thick, uneven, and scarred by previous readers, who had likely been just as desperate as he was. Symbols danced across the parchment, their meanings layered beneath centuries of interpretation and secrecy. Some scholars dismissed such works as superstition, the leftovers of forgotten minds, but the alchemist sensed a quiet coherence within the chaos, as though the words were trying to speak across time. He traced one line with the back of a fingernail, listening for something only he could hear. The idea that a human might reset the world was unbelievable to most, yet it had threaded itself through the wisdom of older civilizations, flickering like an ember waiting for the right spark. He leaned closer to the furnace again, watching the vessel inside tremble as if resisting the heat. It was not gold he chased, nor wealth, nor glory. Those were distractions for lesser seekers. What he wanted was a moment of revelation so complete that it could tilt the future in a different direction. His loneliness, his sleeplessness, his aching hands, these were simply the tolls paid at the threshold of knowledge. And tonight, as the fire glowed with unusual steadiness, he felt the faintest shift in the air, as though the room itself leaned forward to witness what he might uncover. Still, beneath his steady movements, a single truth pulsed quietly. There was no guarantee he would succeed. Many before him had tried. Some vanished into madness. Some destroyed their own work before anyone else could see it, and some had died with the final question still burning inside them. But this uncertainty only sharpened his resolve. If the world was truly sliding into darkness, then someone had to search for the hidden paths that might lead it back toward light. Outside, the night deepened, stretching its quiet fingers across the rooftops. Inside, the alchemist raised his gaze from the flickering flame to the heavy manuscript waiting for him. The characters seemed to shimmer, as though they contained stories older than memory. Something about them felt like an invitation, or maybe a warning. His breath slowed, and the silence tightened, holding every part of the scene in place. Somewhere between the lines of that ancient text, he believed the first clues to his impossible idea were waiting. And as he reached for the manuscript with stained fingers, the question whispered through the shadows, drawing the listener deeper. Where did such dangerous visions begin? When the mind drifts away from that lonely room and rises above the flickering furnace, the world of the alchemist begins to expand. His small chamber, with its cracked walls and weak candlelight, is only one thread in a tapestry woven across centuries. To understand why he labors so patiently in the dark, we must step back from the smoke, from the smell of heated metal and old parchment, and look at the tradition that shaped him. For men like him, alchemy was never simply the childish dream of turning lead into gold. It was a language for reading reality, a way of understanding how everything might be connected beneath the surface. Matter, spirit, and time were not separate realms. They were parts of the same hidden fabric, and if one strand could be adjusted, the others might shiver in response. In this worldview, metals were not just substances. They were symbols of inner states, stages of growth, echoes of cosmic rhythms. Fire was not just fire, but a teacher. Water carried memory. Air described possibility. Earth held secrets. Each element whispered clues about how the universe moved through its endless cycles. And because the universe moved, alchemists believed they might move with it, nudging certain patterns, encouraging others, and perhaps guiding existence back toward a lost state of harmony. They did not see themselves as inventors. They saw themselves as interpreters of a creation that had been written long before their birth. But the knowledge they inherited was fractured. Through generations, alchemy traveled across lands and languages, changing shape as it passed from one culture to another. Some pieces came from Egypt, wrapped in stories about gods who governed transformation. Other fragments arrived from Greece, filled with philosophical debates about the nature of matter and the soul. Still more insights drifted through the Islamic world, carried by scholars who blended mathematics, medicine, and metaphysics into ideas that shimmered with strange beauty. Yet by the time these whispers reached medieval Europe, they were scattered like torn pages from a book no one had ever read in full. The alchemist in the small room was painfully aware of these fragments. He sensed the gaps, the missing connections, the questions that stretched beyond the borders of his manuscripts. Every symbol he studied felt like a window into something larger, but each window revealed only part of the view. Something was always hidden just out of sight. It was this absence that fueled his obsession. If the original knowledge had once been whole, then its broken state suggested a catastrophe, a fall from understanding. And if something had been lost, perhaps it could be found again. Perhaps the world could be restored to the balance it once knew. To him, the universe was not a fixed structure, but a wounded mechanism. Time did not simply flow, it turned like a wheel. If it could spin forward, then surely it could spin back. The idea of resetting the world was not madness, but a kind of hope. It meant returning to the moment before disease spread through crowded streets, before violence turned fields into dust, before hunger hollowed entire villages. It meant undoing the damage that human hands and unseen forces had carved into the fabric of existence. In this sense, alchemists were less like sorcerers and more like repairers of something sacred. Their symbols reflected this belief. Strange diagrams of circles within circles, serpents swallowing their own tails, suns rising inside moons. These were not instructions for minting gold. They were attempts to describe cycles of creation and decay. Some symbols pointed toward the possibility of rebirth, others toward dissolution, and a few hinted at ideas so vast they almost trembled with meaning. Moments when the world might fold in on itself, collapse, or reset entirely. To the casual observer, these images looked like riddles. To the alchemist, they were maps. The church dismissed much of this work as superstition. Yet even some theologians admitted that creation might have layers, and that God's design could include secrets accessible only through deep contemplation. Meanwhile, the common people saw alchemists as either eccentric, harmless figures or shadowy manipulators of nature. Neither view captured the subtler truth. These practitioners lived in a world that felt precarious, uncertain, and easily broken. For them, searching for the hidden order beneath chaos was not a luxury. It was a form of survival. Imagine living in a century where death swept through towns without warning, where kings demanded loyalty while failing to provide safety, where crops withered after too much rain or too little light. In such a world, the desire to find underlying laws was not strange. It was natural. And the thought that those laws might allow the world to be corrected was even more alluring. If the universe had once been balanced, then perhaps a careful hand could restore it. Perhaps meaning was not entirely lost. This is why our solitary alchemist worked by the glow of his furnace while everyone else slept. He believed that the fragments scattered across time were pieces of a single truth. With enough patience, perhaps he could reassemble them. What if lead becoming gold was only a metaphor for a far deeper transformation? What if the strangest symbols were not about wealth, but about rewinding existence, returning it to a moment before it drifted off course? The thought haunted him every night. It drew him closer to his manuscripts, closer to the fire, closer to the quiet pulse of ideas that no one else seemed to hear. And as these fragments shimmered in his mind, he could not help wondering where they originated, who had written the first lines, and what stories had been carried through time to reach his hands in such fractured form. Those questions, once opened, refused to close. They point toward the earliest texts, the legendary writers, and the darker lines that hint the world we know might not be the first version of itself. And so, as the night deepens, the lens begins to shift once more, drawing us toward the origins of these ancient whispers and the shadowy figures who first tried to explain them. When we step beyond the alchemist's narrow room and look at the world surrounding him, the landscape feels unsettled, as though the ground itself breathes with unease. Medieval life unfolded under a sky filled with warnings. Plague drifted through streets without pattern, leaving homes silent overnight. Famine followed harsh winters or failed harvests, reminding entire villages that survival depended on forces far beyond their control. People woke each day uncertain whether the world would still be standing by dusk. Comets, eclipses, strange halos around the moon, signs that modern minds might interpret as harmless, felt like direct messages from a realm both powerful and unreadable. To those who lived in that time, the universe seemed close, watching, occasionally shaking the pieces of existence in ways no one could prepare for. This constant tension shaped their thoughts, their prayers, their fears. When a bell tolling in the distance announced another death, families paused, wondering whether their home would be next. When the wind carried the smell of sickness, they closed shutters and whispered names of saints. Even the clergy spoke in tones that mixed comfort with warning. A priest might stand before a small congregation and declare that every disaster was a reminder to remain alert, for the end of days could arrive without a moment's notice. His voice would echo through the stone church, thick with smoke from candles burning low, leaving listeners to ponder whether they should repent or simply accept that fate moved according to some hidden pattern. Imagine a peasant walking home under a blood-red moon, unsure whether its unnatural colour marks the arrival of judgment or merely the presence of dust in the upper air. He clutches his cloak tighter, feeling the cold seep into his bones. Nearby, a child asks his mother whether the world will survive the winter, for the sky seems heavier than it did yesterday. No one can answer with certainty. Life feels rehearsed, like a fragile performance taking place on a stage built from wood too thin to hold its actors. Every moment seems temporary, as though one unexpected tremor could bring everything crashing down. Within this atmosphere of collective dread, the alchemist's quiet experiments take on a new meaning. He is not merely an eccentric figure chasing impossible dreams. He is responding to a world that already feels unstable, a world always leaning toward collapse. While others search for signs in the heavens, he studies patterns in his manuscripts. While villagers fear that a comet signals ruin, he wonders whether such celestial events might reveal the underlying rhythm of creation. His furnace burns because he refuses to surrender to the idea that existence is slipping away. Instead, he turns to his tools, convinced that understanding the hidden structure of reality might offer a way to restore balance before everything unravels. Night after night, he listens to the fears of those around him. A priest warns that the harvest's failure is divine punishment. A merchant speaks of distant lands where whole populations have vanished. A traveler tells stories of storms that come without clouds, lightning that strikes in silence, and rivers that change course as though pushed by invisible hands. The alchemist absorbs these stories without judgment. He says little, nodding with a kind of solemn understanding, and then returns to his small room where the world's chaos feels more distant. The fire in his furnace becomes a symbol not only of transformation, but of resistance against the creeping feeling that the universe is sliding toward an ending no one can prevent. Yet the deeper he delves into the manuscripts that guide his work, the stranger the ideas become. Most people believe history is a straight line, moving from past to present without repetition. But the alchemist knows that several ancient texts describe something far different. Hidden among the symbols and allegories are references to previous ages, destroyed worlds, and forgotten beginnings. These writings speak of cycles rather than lines, suggesting that existence may have been remade more than once. One passage describes a time when the earth was renewed after suffering a great dissolution. Another hints that humanity has risen from ashes older than any recorded empire. The language is cryptic, but the implication is unmistakable. The world has ended before. This revelation creates the first true tremor in the listener's mind. If medieval life already felt like it balanced on the edge of catastrophe, what would it mean to believe that earlier worlds had collapsed entirely? And what would it mean for an alchemist to attempt to build a device capable of restarting the cycle? His obsession suddenly feels less irrational. Perhaps he is not trying to reshape the world because it is failing. Perhaps he believes he is simply following a pattern as old as creation itself. Such ideas were not spoken openly. To share them could invite suspicion, fear, or accusation. Yet the manuscripts remained, surviving plagues, fires, and wars. The alchemist reads these lines by candlelight, tracing each symbol with care. He wonders whether the universe leaves clues for those patient enough to search for them. He wonders whether the instability people feel is not a sign of approaching ruin, but a sign that the cycle is nearing its turning point. And he wonders whether his work, fragile as it seems, might influence what happens when that turning arrives. Outside his window, the night grows colder. Villagers huddle in their homes, whispering prayers for protection. The moon dips behind drifting clouds, and shadows stretch across the empty streets. But inside the alchemist's room, the furnace glows brighter, reflecting in his eyes as he studies the page before him. Tonight, he focuses on a passage hinting at a moment when time folds back upon itself, when creation resets, and when only those prepared for the change can guide the world into its new form. It is written in obscure metaphors, but he senses the truth pulsing beneath the surface. He closes the manuscript with a slow breath. The fragility of the world outside suddenly feels connected to something far larger. If the past contains traces of earlier resets, then the present may also be part of that cycle. And if the cycle is real, someone must have been the first to describe it. Someone must have written the text that survived long enough to inspire his dangerous hope. As the final embers shift inside the furnace, the narrator turns toward the question, waiting in the shadows. Who were the earliest voices to speak of these cycles? And how did their words travel across time to reach this solitary room? Long before the Middle Ages shaped the lonely alchemist with his flickering furnace, the roots of his craft stretched back into lands where time moved differently, where memory and myth blended so softly that they became a single breath. To understand his strange obsession, we must drift far beyond the stone alleys of medieval towns and sink into the ancient worlds that first learned to coax secrets from fire. It begins in Egypt, under a sky so wide and unmoving that night seemed like an endless ocean. Temple scribes walked through dim corridors carrying oil lamps whose flames quivered against painted walls. In quiet rooms filled with incense, smoke, they recorded the transformations they witnessed. Metals glowing like miniature suns, powders changing color at a whisper of heat, stones cracking open to reveal hidden veins of brilliance. To them, these transformations were not tricks. They were signs that matter had a hidden life, shaped by mysterious forces that only the patient could observe. Artisans working near the Nile watched molten bronze swirl inside clay crucibles, its surface rippling like a burning river. They saw shapes melt, merge, and harden into forms no one could have predicted from their origins. A lump of dull ore could become a tool, a mirror, or an object meant for offerings. Fire, in their eyes, was not merely a tool, it was a gateway. Something about its ability to reshape the physical world suggested a deeper truth. Reality might not be fixed at all. Perhaps the universe itself could shift, bend, or move backward the way metal flowed from solid to liquid and back again. The earliest observers did not write complicated theories. They simply watched and felt the quiet awe of recognizing that the world responded to touch in ways they had never imagined. As time carried these discoveries along the currents of history, Greece added its voice to the growing whisper. Wandering philosophers debated the nature of existence under open skies. Some walked from one city to another with nothing but a cloak, asking anyone who would listen whether the universe was made from water, fire, or the shadows of invisible particles. Their questions were not idle. They sensed that human beings were standing on the edge of an enormous mystery. When they saw metals transformed by heat, or powders altered by strange mixtures, they believed they were glimpsing the hidden architecture of creation. If a substance could become something else, then perhaps the soul could change. Perhaps worlds could change. Perhaps time itself was not the straight road people assumed it to be. These early thinkers left fragments behind, small pieces of writing, tucked into scrolls, half-erased names, and symbols that carried meanings few understood. Later generations called these texts hermetic, believing they came from a being who straddled the line between God and mortal. According to legend, he wrote volumes of wisdom so powerful that priests hid them beneath temples or sealed them inside stone chambers. Some stories claim that only a handful of chosen individuals were allowed to read them, and that these individuals learned secrets about the universe that could not be spoken aloud. Whether these tales were true hardly mattered. What mattered was the feeling they stirred, the sense that knowledge existed beyond the reach of ordinary lives, waiting in silence for someone brave enough to find it. Alongside these legends grew murmurs of older civilizations, hinted at but never fully described. Some believed that before Egypt rose from the desert, another world had flourished and then fallen, its monuments swallowed by sand or sea. Others suggested that humanity had lived through cycles of destruction and renewal, and that small fragments of wisdom survived each time, carried forward like seeds through a storm. These stories remained vague, wrapped in metaphor and symbol, yet their persistence whispered something unsettling. If the earliest texts contained hints of worlds before ours, then perhaps alchemy was not simply a study of metals, but a study of memory itself, a memory too ancient to classify, too scattered to assemble, yet too powerful to ignore. The narrator drifts through these ancient landscapes with a sense of reverence, guiding the listener through scenes that feel like half-remembered dreams. A scribe grinding minerals beneath flickering lamplight. A philosopher watching steam rise from heated water, wondering whether breath, soul, and vapor are somehow related. An artisan pouring molten gold into a mold, unaware that countless generations will interpret this act as a symbol of inner transformation. These moments seem small, yet they carry a weight that stretches across centuries. In their simplicity lies the birth of an idea, that transformation is woven into the fabric of existence, and that anyone who understands transformation might influence far larger patterns. Centuries later, medieval alchemists would cling to these fragments with a kind of hunger. They believed that the ancient writings held clues to forgotten ages when the world may have been shaped differently, or perhaps rebuilt after unimaginable disaster. They studied faded symbols with trembling fingers, searching for glimpses of older truths. To them, the legends of secret books buried under temples were not just myths. They were echoes of civilizations erased by time. And if reality had changed before, they reasoned, then perhaps it could change again. Perhaps the universe had always been pliable, responding to those who understood the delicate balance between matter, spirit, and the unseen forces that moved through everything. As we drift from temple chambers and philosophical debates back toward the medieval world, a question hangs in the air like dust suspended in sunlit stillness. How did these early whispers survive so many centuries? How did fragile stories written on brittle scrolls travel across deserts, seas, and empires to land on the workbench of a solitary alchemist? The answer waits beyond the horizon of this ancient memory, drawing us gently toward the next step in the journey. Knowledge does not move cleanly across centuries. It drifts, slips, fractures, and reforms, much like metal melting inside a furnace. To understand why medieval alchemists inherited such strange, unreliable manuscripts, we must follow the winding path that ancient ideas travelled. The trail begins after the worlds of Egypt and Greece dimmed, when their scrolls scattered like embers into different hands. Some were carried across deserts by traders who valued parchment for its weight rather than its meaning. Others were rescued by scholars who sensed that old wisdom deserved protection. But most were swept into the vast intellectual tide of the Islamic Golden Age, where curiosity became a kind of devotion. Inside candlelit rooms in Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo, translators laboured over texts that had already lived many lives. They compared Greek passages with Syriac versions, then aligned them with Persian notes, weaving 3 or 4 languages into a single strand. Their goal was preservation, yet even the most careful scribe brought new interpretations with each mark of ink. Sometimes a word had no perfect equivalent, so a translator chose an approximation. Sometimes a line held an idea too perplexing to express, so he left it vague, hoping the next reader would understand. The manuscripts became palimpsests of intention and uncertainty. These scholars admired the ancient thinkers, but they did not trust them completely. Some ideas seemed harmless recipes for dyes, instructions for refining metals, notes about the behavior of heat. But other passages stirred unease. Lines hinting at transformation of the soul, diagrams suggesting that matter responded to unseen forces, or descriptions of cycles in which worlds rose and fell. These pieces lingered like smoke in the corners of their minds. The scholars preserved them because they felt important, yet the importance was wrapped in mystery. And when something feels both valuable and dangerous, it is often copied quietly, without discussion. As decades passed, the texts travelled again. Conquerors, merchants and diplomats carried copies to distant regions. Libraries gained them, libraries lost them. Fire consumed some. Floods erased others. Still, enough survived to cross into monastic Europe, where monks in cold scriptoria sat hunched over narrow desks, dipping quills into ink that thickened in winter's chill. They worked slowly, following lines they barely understood. Latin translations grew from Arabic versions that had grown from Greek originals. With each generation, the text changed a little, like a whisper carried through a long corridor. But something subtle and unsettling happened in this chain of copying. Asterisk, asterisk, context dissolved, asterisk, asterisk. Margins filled with explanations disappeared when scribes, rushed or exhausted, ignored the smaller notes. Diagrams were redrawn with slight modifications, sometimes by monks who did not grasp the symbolic meaning behind the shapes. A circle might become an oval. A serpent might lose its tail. A sequence of steps might be condensed because it felt repetitive. One missing sentence could turn a metaphor into an instruction, or an instruction into a riddle. Knowledge that had once been clear now arrived in fragments. Occasionally, a translator encountered a passage that disturbed him. Perhaps it implied that creation could be reversed, or that matter carried memories, or that the world had lived through cycles long before human beings recorded time. These ideas, unsettling even today, were far more alarming in ages ruled by strict theology. And so, some scribes altered the lines. They softened the implications, adjusted the symbols, or inserted safer interpretations. Others simply skipped the passages they feared, leaving blank spaces where meaning once lived. In a few rare cases, censors crossed out entire paragraphs, attempting to bury ideas they believed could mislead or harm. By the time these manuscripts reached medieval alchemists, they were beautiful ruins, patchworks stitched together from centuries of caution and curiosity. A single page might contain a Greek theory, a Persian comment, an Arabic correction, and a Latin note squeezed into a narrow margin. Each layer reflected a different mind, a different fear, a different hope. For the alchemist reading by firelight, these inconsistencies were not flaws, they were mysteries. Every missing piece invited speculation. Every alteration hinted at secrets withheld by earlier generations. And every strange symbol felt like a message from a world older than the one outside his window. This uncertainty became fertile ground for imagination. When a text repeated a symbol several times without explanation, the alchemist believed it must hold meaning too powerful to describe openly. When a diagram appeared incomplete, he assumed the missing portion had been hidden on purpose. And when the language shifted abruptly from practical instructions to cosmic allegory, he sensed that he was touching the edge of forbidden knowledge. The ambiguity allowed fear and ambition to grow together. feeding the idea that the universe contained mechanisms waiting to be reset by those who dared to understand them. Nighttime listeners understand this feeling intuitively. They know what it is like to read between the lines, to suspect that official versions of history are polished surfaces hiding deeper stories. They recognize that preservation is never perfect, and that survivors of ancient knowledge often carry scars from the journey. This section speaks directly to that instinct. It invites the audience to imagine how many hands touched these manuscripts, how many minds shaped them, and how many truths were bent or blurred along the way. Picture a translator hesitating over a symbol he cannot interpret. He considers writing a note but decides against it. Picture a monk reading a line that contradicts doctrine. He pauses, frowns, and quietly adjusts the wording. Picture a scholar copying a diagram with trembling hands because he fears he is recording something he should not fully understand. These small, human choices accumulated over centuries, subtly altering the map of knowledge. They left behind a trail of distorted fragments that medieval alchemists mistook for clues. And yet, despite all the errors and omissions, something survived, something powerful enough to ignite the imagination of those who spent their nights searching for hidden patterns. The alchemist in his stone room sensed this survival. When he opened a manuscript, he felt he was holding a message delivered across impossible distances. Each damaged page suggested that the original texts contained ideas too significant to discard, even when dangerous. And if the parts he could read were already so strange, what about the parts that had been lost? As the candlelight flickers and the alchemist straightens a brittle page, the narrator draws the threads together. These texts traveled across empires, languages, and beliefs. They survived wars, floods, and fear, and they arrived in Europe, altered but alive, carrying broken echoes of ancient worlds. Now, in a cold room lit by a stubborn fire, a solitary figure studies them, unaware that centuries of distortion have shaped the words before him. The lens tightens, returning to that small chamber, where he bends once again over the manuscript that has consumed so many of his nights. Across the ancient world, long before scholars debated equations or charted the heavens with polished instruments, people sensed that existence did not unfold in a straight line. They believed the world moved in circles, rising and falling the way seasons shift or stars return to familiar places. These early minds watched floods sweep entire valleys away, watched fires devour forests until the land turned black, watched storms tear through villages without mercy. From these cycles of destruction and renewal grew a deeper intuition. Perhaps the universe itself followed rhythms far larger than any single lifetime. In Babylonian myths, ages of humanity ended beneath rising waters. In Greek stories, worlds burned under celestial flames before emerging again in renewed form. Time, they thought, did not simply pass, it reset. The narrator drifts through these ancient beliefs with the gentleness of a hand brushing over an old tapestry. Each culture described the cycles differently, yet the pattern remained the same. There were golden ages of harmony, silver ages of decline, and darker ages when corruption grew heavy enough to bring everything down. Then, through some vast transition flood, fire, or unnamed force, the world returned to its beginning, like a wheel completing its turn. People living in those ages saw themselves as participants in a story far older than their own families, believing the universe breathed through eras of growth and collapse. As centuries flowed forward, these ideas slipped quietly into the writings that alchemists treasured. Though many passages spoke of metals changing or of personal refinement, some lines glimmered with echoes of older myths. Phrases like purification by fire and renewal of the world appeared alongside instructions for distilling liquids or heating minerals. Medieval readers, lacking the context of ancient cosmologies, encountered these words without knowing their original purpose. To them, such language did not describe metaphorical cycles of existence. It hinted at something far more literal, the possibility that the world could be cleansed, reshaped, or revived through a process modelled on the behaviour of matter itself. The alchemical concept of returning to the times prima materia, times the primordial substance from which all things arise, took on new layers of meaning when paired with these older myths. If everything emerged from a single original material, then perhaps everything could return to it. And if matter could be refined by passing through flames, then perhaps the universe could undergo a similar purification. What began as symbolic language became a foundation for speculation. For medieval alchemists already attuned to signs of instability in their world, the idea that existence might dissolve and reform felt strangely plausible. The narrator moves slowly through these thoughts, inviting the listener to feel the ancient weight behind them. Imagine an alchemist turning a brittle page, tracing a phrase written centuries earlier. For the world must be perfected as metal is perfected. To modern minds, the line might appear poetic, but to someone living in a century where plague, war, and famine shaped daily life, it could read like a warning or instruction. If metal became stronger, purer, and more radiant after passing through fire, then perhaps the world, too, would face its own furnace. A moment of revelation arrives, as the narrator reveals obscure passages from old commentaries, texts rarely copied, preserved only in fragments. These passages speak not of a single spirit's refinement, but of the entire world passing through the furnace, that all impurity may be removed. The imagery is startling. It suggests a belief that reality itself could be melted down the way a smith melts flawed metal, allowing it to be cast again in a more harmonious form. The furnace becomes more than a tool. It becomes a cosmic engine, capable of dissolving everything into its original state before shaping it anew. This idea, once introduced, lingers like a whisper that refuses to fade. It binds the myths of ancient civilizations to the experiments of medieval alchemists, creating a bridge of meaning across vast distances of time. To the late-night listener, the metaphor strikes with unusual clarity. The world as molten metal, imperfectly cast, bearing cracks and weaknesses no amount of patching can fix. And somewhere, hidden in shadowed rooms, individuals believed they might play a role in returning it to its raw state. The narrator does not claim this belief was universal. Most alchemists worked quietly, focusing on personal transformation or the pursuit of elusive materials. But among the many texts, scattered like broken tiles, a few lines glimmered with a deeper ambition. They hinted at cycles of creation far grander than the transformation of metals. They hinted that human beings, through understanding and intention, might participate in the renewal of the universe. Whether these ideas were misunderstood metaphors or deliberate teachings remains uncertain. Yet ambiguity itself became a powerful force. Medieval practitioners, interpreting fragments through their own fears and hopes, found in these passages a sense of purpose that stretched beyond the confines of their small rooms. This section speaks directly to viewers who search for patterns in history, who suspect that civilizations rise and fall with rhythmic inevitability. It offers them a framework as old as recorded myth, a pattern they can overlay onto theories of lost continents, forgotten empires, or worlds erased before memory began. The cycles described by ancient cultures do not conflict with modern conspiracies. They enrich them. They create an intellectual space where myth, speculation, and secret knowledge intertwine. As the narrator drifts between these cycles, a quiet unease settles in. If the world is indeed one imperfect pouring of metal, then perhaps everything we know rests on a foundation shaped by earlier failures. The idea invites contemplation rather than fear, encouraging the listener to imagine the universe as a craftsman's workshop. Experiments, adjustments, revisions. And somewhere within that workshop, a human mind might attempt to understand the design. The section closes by returning to the central character of the series, not yet named, not yet fully understood, but already changed by the fragments he studies. If the universe truly moves through cycles of renewal, then he must ask himself a daring question. How could one person, living within a single fragile lifetime, hope to participate in such a vast process? What role could a quiet alchemist play in the furnace of the world? The answer waits in the next turn of the narrative, where the lens shifts from cosmic cycles to the lonely figure who believes he can influence them. A medieval alchemist did not live in a grand chamber filled with gleaming instruments or shelves stacked with gold. He lived in a narrow cell, where the ceiling carried soot like a permanent night sky, and the air tasted faintly of metal, smoke, and something older. The room felt closer to a cave than a workshop, lit by wavering candlelight that never quite defeated the shadows. Tiny jars lined the walls, their surfaces scratched with symbols that meant everything to him and almost nothing to anyone else. Scraps of parchment curled at the edges, pinned into place with bent nails, each containing a note from another midnight experiment that had left him too tired to write more than a few urgent words. His days were shaped by tasks so repetitive they blurred together. He ate little, usually a crust of bread or a spoonful of broth left cooling beside his furnace. Meals were interruptions, not events. When he slept, it happened in brief, scattered moments, his head resting against his folded arms or his back against the stone wall. Sometimes he woke unsure whether minutes or hours had passed. Time, inside this cramped space, obeyed the rhythm of fire instead of the rhythm of clocks. The first heating marked the beginning of a day. The long wait, when metal softened and vapors drifted upward, marked the quiet middle. And the final shift of color, the moment when something either transformed or stubbornly refused to change, marked the end. Outside, the world moved with its own steady heartbeat. Church bells rang at dawn, then again at midday, and finally in the evening, though the alchemist rarely lifted his head when they sounded. Distant arguments drifted through the window at unpredictable hours. A cart rattled by, bouncing over uneven stones. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked at shadows. These noises reminded him that life continued without him, that people were buying bread, washing clothes, discussing weather, and worrying about matters that had nothing to do with furnaces or metals or cosmic patterns. Yet even as he heard them, they felt unreal, like faint echoes from another world. His world began and ended inside this cell. The furnace dominated the room with its stubborn glow. It required endless attention, like a creature that responded only to patience. He fed it thin sticks of wood, fanned it gently with a scrap of woven reed, and adjusted the iron grate by small degrees until the flame behaved. Sometimes the fire roared too strongly, and he had to choke it with ash. Other times it weakened without warning, threatening to die before reaching the temperature he needed. Each shift forced him to adapt. Failure was not dramatic. It happened quietly, in small ways, a flame too weak, a vessel too cool, a mixture stirred at the wrong moment. He spent hours correcting tiny mistakes, chasing consistency in a world that rarely offered it. When metals refused to transform, frustration pressed against his ribs. He felt it in the tightening of his jaw, the lingering tension in his shoulders. He stared at the dull surface of the cooled mixture, willing it to reveal a clue. Sometimes he blamed himself. Sometimes he blamed the impurities hidden within the materials. And sometimes, in the deepest hours of night, he wondered whether the universe simply resisted him. Fear entered the room when glass cracked under sudden heat. The sound was sharp, too loud in the enclosed space, and he always froze for a moment, imagining shards flying into his hands or face. After each break, he swept the pieces away carefully, aware that he had lost not only a vessel but many hours of effort. Yet despite the failures, hope refused to die. Every now and then a substance shifted in a way he did not expect. The flame flickered strangely, or the color inside the crucible moved through shades he had not written about in his notes. Those moments revived him more than food or sleep. A single unusual glimmer could send him into another long stretch of concentrated work, convinced he stood on the edge of discovering something that might unlock deeper truths. Hope was a dangerous companion. It made him ignore cold drafts creeping under the door, ignore the ache in his spine, ignore the tremor in his fingers when exhaustion reached its peak. His emotional world was a cycle as demanding as any experiment. Doubt crept in often. He questioned whether his path was madness, whether dedication could become a type of blindness. But then he remembered the fragile state of the world outside the plague carts, the empty houses, the whispers of unstable seasons. The universe already felt wounded. His work, strange as it seemed, felt like an answer to that wound. If he could understand the hidden structure beneath all things, maybe he could repair some part of it. Maybe he could soothe the fractures no one else could see. He rarely spoke to others about his experiments. Conversations exhausted him more than broken glass or cooling metal. Most people did not want to hear about furnaces or alchemical stages. They wanted practical help, reassurance, or gossip. When he did speak, his words sounded distant, like borrowed phrases. People mistook his silence for arrogance or oddity, but it was simply the natural result of spending so much time inside his mind. Thoughts flowed constantly, touching on notes he needed to refine, ideas he needed to test, and symbols he needed to interpret. There was always more to consider than his waking hours allowed. At night, when the workshop dimmed and the fire dropped to a softer glow, his isolation felt sharpest. The walls seemed to lean inward, crowding around his thoughts. Shadows stretched like long fingers across the floor. He sometimes imagined the darkness carried memories of earlier nights, lingering like the scent of smoke. In this solitude, failures weighed heavily. The universe felt immense. He felt small. But he also felt the pull of something deeper, the sense that a truth waited just beyond his reach, shimmering somewhere between imagination and discovery. He kept a small notebook near the furnace, bound with a fraying cord. Each time he paused, he wrote, not full sentences, just fragments. A shift in colour, a sudden bubble, a faint crack at the base of a vessel. His handwriting slanted sharply, shaped by haste and fatigue. These notes contained his entire world. They held his disappointments, his rare successes, and the quiet accidents that hinted at possibilities he did not yet understand. When he flipped through the pages, they rustled like dry leaves, whispering patterns only he could follow. It is here, as he leans over the notebook and the furnace hums, that the narrator begins to drift toward the next mystery. These small pages, filled with cramped script and secret observations, hold traces of something more, something waiting to be uncovered in the next section. The alchemist's notebooks were nothing like the orderly manuscripts kept by merchants or priests. They were messy, intimate, and strangely alive, as if the pages were attempting to map thoughts that could barely hold still. When opened, they released a faint scent of smoke and oil, mixed with the dry whisper of parchment worn thin by restless fingers. To him, these notebooks were not simply records. They were rehearsals of reality, quiet attempts to reshape existence on paper before daring to attempt such transformations in the furnace. Each entry marked a moment when imagination reached toward the world's hidden structure, trying to touch something just beyond comprehension. The first pages held drawings, furnaces sketched in quick strokes, crucibles outlined with uneven lines, flames rising like slender fingers. Some diagrams looked practical, meant to remind him of angles and temperatures. Others felt symbolic, almost dreamlike. He drew suns with faces, serpents coiled around circles, and shapes that resembled nothing known in nature. These images were not decorations. They were part of the language he used to think. When words failed to express an idea, he turned to symbols. When symbols felt insufficient, he turned to fragments of poetry. And when neither words nor symbols could capture the movement of a thought, he left a gap, a blank space that implied more than it revealed. As the narrator guides the viewer deeper into the notebooks, a strange pattern emerges. The writing does not flow in a straight line. Instead, it moves in layers, shifting between technical notes, private reflections, and lines that could be mistaken for spells. One sentence might describe the precise moment when a mixture should be stirred. The next might ask whether the soul behaves like a vapor, rising and falling with unseen heat. And after that, a fragment might appear. The dragon sleeps beneath the ash. These metaphors were not meant to be literal. They were ways of expressing ideas too delicate to explain directly ideas about creation, destruction, and the strange boundary between the two. Some passages read like confessions. He wrote about the weight of failure, the fear that he misunderstood everything, and the moments when hope flickered unexpectedly. In other places, the tone shifted entirely. The writing became distant, almost detached, as if he were recording observations from a different vantage point, one outside the limits of normal experience. These abrupt changes revealed a mind stretched between physical experiments and unseen realms of thought. He was not only heating metals, he was testing ideas about the nature of time, the behavior of matter, and the possibility that reality might respond to intention. The coded phrases scattered throughout the pages deepened the mystery. Some lines appeared to reference known processes, but in language so obscured it was impossible to interpret them clearly. When the second sun rises within the vessel, withdraw the breath at once. Another read, let death refine death until only life remains. These statements could be metaphors for stages of purification, or they could be clues pointing towards something more unsettling. Medieval alchemists often wrote in code to protect their secrets, but the codes in these notebooks felt different. They suggested that the writer feared not theft, but completion, that some experiments were meant to remain unfinished. The viewer is invited to consider this possibility. What if essential steps were intentionally omitted, not out of caution, but out of dread? The alchemist might have believed that the full process was too powerful or too dangerous to record plainly. He might have sensed that writing it clearly could invite misuse, or worse, success, by someone unable to understand the consequences. Gaps in the instructions became warnings disguised as omissions. The notebook became a labyrinth where every path led deeper into uncertainty, leaving the reader wondering whether the missing pieces should ever be found. The narrator moves gently through these ideas, allowing the audience to feel the eerie stillness that surrounds the notebooks. In some entries, the alchemist speculated about transformations not only of metals, but of the world itself. He described matter returning to its original state, the dissolution of structures, and the rebirth of forms purged of imperfection. These were not abstract musings. They were attempts to imagine what might happen if the universe behaved like the mixtures inside his furnace. The notebooks became alternate timelines, a catalogue of possibilities, each reflecting a different version of reality he hoped, feared, or nearly believed could exist. One page contained a simple drawing, a circle divided into 4 segments, each labelled with a single word. But the words were not familiar elemental names. Instead, they read beginning, falling, forgotten, and return. The viewer is left to interpret their meaning. Were they the stages of a cosmic cycle, a coded sequence for an experiment, or a personal meditation on the world's fragility? The ambiguity is deliberate. The alchemist understood that certainty can be a trap. By leaving room for interpretation, he allowed thought itself to shift like molten metal, taking new shapes with every reading. He seemed to sense that these notebooks might outlive him. His handwriting grew more deliberate on certain pages, as if he were addressing an unseen reader, someone who would discover these fragments long after his furnace had gone cold. Who did he imagine would read them? Another alchemist? A scholar? Or someone from a later age, searching for patterns in the debris of history? This question lingers in the margins, adding another layer of mystery to the notebook's purpose. Perhaps he wrote for himself alone, or perhaps he wrote for a future mind he believed could complete what he dared not finish. For the audience, these notebooks feel like forbidden manuals documents that belong to the same lineage as ancient grimoires, coded scrolls, or modern files hidden in forgotten folders. They bridge the gap between myth and curiosity, offering glimpses of methods that seem both scientific and mystical. They allow viewers to imagine what might happen if someone today found such a notebook and attempted to follow its steps. Would they reconstruct an unfinished experiment, or awaken something the original writer wished to bury? As the narrator lingers on sketches of strange symbols and circles, the atmosphere grows heavier. The pages shimmer with intent and hesitation, filled with ideas that never fully crystallized. And with this lingering tension comes the next question. If the notebooks held such dangerous potential, who was watching the alchemist as he wrote them? The alchemist's cell did not exist in a vacuum. Beyond its soot-stained ceiling and simmering furnace lay a town filled with people who did not understand him, yet could not quite ignore him. His work lived at the fragile edge where faith, suspicion, and survival collided. From the outside, his room looked harmless enough. A narrow door, a small window, and the faint glow of candlelight late into the night. But neighbours whispered that strange smells rose from that room, carrying hints of burning herbs, heated metals, and mixtures no one recognized. Some claimed the smoke curled in unusual patterns. Others insisted they heard low humming at impossible hours. None of them knew what he was trying to accomplish, but they all sensed it was something the ordinary world was not built to contain. In medieval towns, alchemists occupied an uneasy position. They were tolerated when their experiments produced dyes, medicines, or helpful powders. They were mocked when their mixtures failed or their predictions proved wrong, and they were feared when the fire cracked too loudly or the night glowed too brightly behind their shuttered windows. To many villagers, anything happening after midnight carried a stain of danger. Work done in darkness seemed to blur the line between curiosity and sin. And so the alchemist lived with the constant awareness that his neighbour's acceptance could turn to hostility with little warning. He learned to move through the streets quietly, head down, mind focused. Children stared at him, but kept their distance. Merchants nodded politely, but never lingered in conversation. Even those who depended on his medicines approached with hesitance, as though touching one of his bottles might invite misfortune. He managed these interactions with care, offering reassurance without revealing anything about his deeper pursuits. His true experiments, those that dealt with cycles, transformation, and the hidden structure of existence, remained sealed behind his door. This secrecy created a tension that grew sharper with every passing day. He wanted to repair the world he saw crumbling around him, yet that same world might punish him for trying. Patrons visited occasionally, drawn by rumors that an alchemist could coax gold from common metal. They arrived wrapped in cloaks, voices low, offering coins or favors in exchange for miracles. He bargained with them cautiously, knowing they could turn against him if disappointed. Producing true gold was impossible, but producing hope was dangerous. A patron who felt cheated could accuse him of fraud. A patron who believed too strongly could demand the impossible. Priests posed another threat. Some tolerated alchemists, viewing them as eccentric craftsmen whose work might reveal divine truths. Others considered alchemy suspicious, a path too close to forbidden knowledge. When a priest visited the alchemist's workshop, the air thickened with unease. The alchemist bowed respectfully, choosing his words with precision. He spoke of purification and inner light, never of cycles, resets, or the furnace of the world. He understood that ideas about reshaping reality had to be hidden inside metaphors of spiritual growth. A direct explanation would be blasphemy. A symbolic one could be dismissed as harmless meditation. Then there were the neighbors, whose concerns were simpler yet equally dangerous. They wanted quiet. They wanted normal. They wanted the strange noises to stop. When someone knocked at his door, the alchemist's hands trembled slightly. The knock was never loud, but it always pierced him with the fear that someone had seen too much. What if a passerby glimpsed the glow at midnight? What if a child smelled the burning mixture from the alley? What if a rumor spread that his work invited something unnatural? The narrator guides the viewer into this growing unease, letting them feel how the alchemist's goals pressed against the boundaries of what society allowed. His cell became both shelter and prison. The furnace that illuminated his work also threatened to expose him. Every experiment had to be timed carefully. Every candle had to be shielded. Even the way he disposed of ash mattered. If his mixtures colored the smoke strangely, someone might notice. If someone noticed, the priest might be informed. And if the priest arrived with suspicions, the alchemist's quiet war against the limits of reality could be extinguished with a single accusation. This pressure forced alchemists to develop a unique form of camouflage. They disguised world-scale ideas beneath layers of spiritual language. When they wrote about dissolving the world into its prima materia, they framed it as the purification of the soul. When they imagined cycles of death and rebirth on a cosmic scale, they described personal enlightenment. When they speculated about returning the universe to its original state, they wrapped the idea in parables about humility or repentance. To priests, such entries looked like meditations. To patrons, they seemed like philosophical distractions. But to a fellow alchemist, the hidden meaning was unmistakable. The series leans into this tension, inviting the viewer to imagine how the alchemist encoded his ambitions. A recipe for medicine could contain a veiled reference to the stages of dissolution. A prayer might hide steps of an experiment. A poem about a rising sun could refer to a substance glowing inside a crucible. This coded language allowed him to continue working without drawing suspicion, while also creating a secret dialogue with others who shared his convictions. It was a subtle rebellion, conducted through ink and metaphor rather than open defiance. Nighttime listeners know this instinct well. They, too, search for patterns tucked within old texts, symbols hidden in art, and meanings buried under surface explanations. This section invites them to feel connected to the alchemist's strategy. It turns decoding into collaboration, transforming the viewer from an observer into a co-conspirator. They come to understand that the alchemist's secrecy was not simply a matter of safety. It was a matter of survival not only for him, but for the ideas he carried. As the tension builds, the narrator highlights the harsh contrast at the heart of the alchemist's life. He wanted to mend a broken world, yet the world demanded he remain small. He wanted to explore cosmic cycles, yet society forced him to discuss only personal purity. He wanted to explain what he sensed in the shifting patterns of matter, yet he could reveal these thoughts to no one. Each day sharpened the boundary between what he believed and what he was allowed to say. Each night deepened the fear that someone might misinterpret his work and destroy everything before he came close to understanding the truth. The section ends with a question rising from the shadows of his cell, a question that pulls the viewer forward with gentle urgency. If his ideas were so dangerous, who decided the boundaries? Who determined what knowledge was allowed and what knowledge had to be hidden? For centuries, The church stood as the great guardian of order, watching over kingdoms, villages, and the invisible borders of acceptable thought. It did not oppose learning, nor did it dismiss inquiry, but it feared anything that seemed to blur the line between human curiosity and divine authority. And so, when whispers began to spread about men who heated metals in the dark, who wrote symbols no one recognized, and who dared to ask how creation itself might be shaped, the church listened with cautious ears. Alchemists walked a narrow path. Some clergy welcomed them, believing their work might yield medicines for the sick or new alloys for sacred vessels. Others, however, sensed something more unsettling in the glow of those private furnaces. The narrator leads the listener through a slow procession of scenes, each unfolding like a memory the world tried to forget. In one dim workshop, an inquisitor stands beside a cluttered table, lifting a small vial holding a liquid that shifts colors when exposed to candlelight. He narrows his eyes, wondering whether this is the work of a curious mind, or the handiwork of someone attempting to imitate divine forces. The alchemist stands silently nearby, hands folded, waiting for the verdict with a tightness in his chest he cannot hide. The inquisitor says nothing accusatory. He simply warns him to stay within proper boundaries, leaving the meaning of those boundaries deliberately vague. Far away, in a bishop's chamber filled with the rustle of parchment, another scene unfolds. A single document lies open on a desk, carved centuries earlier. It details unusual practices observed in a town where a quiet man keeps a furnace burning well past midnight. The report describes strange vapors drifting from his chimney, symbols painted on pieces of slate, and neighbors frightened by sounds like soft chanting. The bishop reads slowly, unsure how to interpret the account. The church cannot punish every rumor, yet a scent of transgression hovers between the lines. His decision is cautious. Send a letter reminding the town's clergy to be vigilant, but avoid immediate judgment. The implication is clear: too much deviation may force the church's hand. The narrator's tone remains calm, but a faint tension threads the air as the story expands into sermons spoken to uneasy congregations. Priests warn their listeners to beware those who seek to grasp what belongs to God alone. They preach about humility and obedience, about trusting the established order of the world. Though no names are spoken, everyone knows someone who works in ways the sermon describes. People return home with glances cast toward the small houses near the edge of town, wondering what happens behind shuttered windows. For the alchemist, these sermons feel like ripples of heat entering his workshop. He knows he has done nothing wrong, yet he also knows how easily misunderstanding can erupt into accusation. If he leaves the furnace burning too brightly, someone may complain. If he buys rare powders from a traveling merchant, someone may whisper. If he writes symbols too freely, someone may assume they are spells. Every part of his work must be hidden beneath a mask of caution. But the narrator reveals something deeper beneath the surface of this fear. Historical records show that some alchemists were not accused merely of fraud or trickery, but of holding beliefs that threatened the structure of creation itself. In one case, an alchemist was charged with imagining that metals could be driven back to their original state, purified beyond what nature allowed. Another record describes accusations that a man believed the world itself could be renewed by flames, drawing terrifying parallels with apocalyptic teachings. Such ideas struck the church not as scientific curiosity, but as attempts to trespass upon divine prerogatives. Alchemists who wrote of purification and rebirth risked being misunderstood as claiming the power to unmake and remake existence. The narrator lingers on the psychological shift such accusations created. When an institution with immense power begins to see transformation as threat, every quiet experiment becomes dangerous. A mixture bubbling too strangely can provoke suspicion. A failed experiment can be interpreted as dark intention. Even a simple question about the nature of matter can sound like doubt in the creator's work. The alchemist, once merely eccentric, becomes a figure cast in a shadow he cannot escape. Yet this tension also reveals why alchemists disguised their most ambitious ideas. They knew the church might tolerate spiritual metaphors but not cosmic speculation. And so they wrote about purifying the soul when they meant purifying nature. They spoke of inner light when they meant the glow of transformed metals. They described personal renewal when imagining the renewal of the entire world. Their manuscripts became double-layered, harmless on the surface, radical beneath. To the listener, it feels like stepping into a secret conversation, one hidden in plain sight. waiting centuries to be decoded. This section speaks directly to the late-night viewer's suspicion that powerful institutions have always acted as gatekeepers of reality. The Church's concern was not entirely irrational. If people believed they could tamper with the order of existence, chaos could follow. But to those who long for the thrill of hidden knowledge, this concern feels like confirmation. It suggests that something meaningful, perhaps even dangerous, lay within those experiments. The narrator draws the focus back to the alchemist's solitary cell. The pressure from outside has become part of his daily life, pressing against him like a cold wind through cracks in the door. A knock at night startles him. A shadow crossing the window makes him pause mid-sentence. He hears footsteps and wonders if authority approaches. Yet he continues, driven by a sense that his work answers a question the world has forgotten how to ask. The story slows as the narrator prepares the next transition. If the alchemist must hide his true intentions, if the Church watches the visible workshops, if fear shadows every public experiment, then one question remains unanswered. Where did the most daring alchemists go when they wanted to attempt something the world would never allow? When public workshops became too dangerous, too visible, or too vulnerable to curious knocks at the door, alchemists learned to step deeper into the quiet folds of the world. They understood that secrecy was not a dramatic flourish, but a form of survival, a way of protecting their work from misunderstanding and the consequences that followed. And so, beneath monasteries, inside locked towers, and in neglected corners of noble estates, small hidden laboratories began to appear. These were not grand chambers but modest rooms, carved out of necessity, shaped by fear and determination. Each one represented a slow withdrawal from a world that refused to see clearly, and a quiet commitment to continue the work no matter how difficult concealment became. The narrator moves gently through these imagined spaces, describing them with the grounded realism that makes secrecy feel tangible. In one monastery, beneath a floor worn smooth by centuries of prayer, a small room lies behind a narrow wooden door. A monk who tended herbs by day might descend into that room at night, carrying a single candle and a pouch of powders. The room contains a second furnace, built low to the ground and shaped to minimize smoke. It sits behind a wall thick enough to mute sound. Shelves carved into stone-holed jars without labels, their contents known only to the hands that placed them there. In another setting, a noble estate hides a locked tower that rises above the courtyard. Servants avoid it, believing it houses dusty records or broken furniture. But inside, an alchemist works by the faint glow of a covered lantern. A trapdoor in the corner opens to a chute that leads to an abandoned well, where ashes and failed mixtures can be discarded without leaving traces near the main house. A narrow slit in the stone wall releases smoke into the night, blending it with the breath of the wind. To anyone outside, the tower appears lifeless. Only the alchemist knows it is the safest place he has. The narrator asks the listener to imagine how carefully one must think to maintain such secrecy. How do you hide the glow of a furnace beneath a door? You place thick cloth along the threshold and time your work for the darkest hours. How do you dump cooling mixtures without alarming the neighbors? You carry them in sealed jars to distant streams at dawn when fishermen have not yet arrived. How do you disguise the sound of metal striking metal? You wrap your tools in cloth and work slowly, lifting and lowering each piece with deliberate care. These are not the techniques of sorcerers but the quiet strategies of individuals trying to remain unseen. Some hidden laboratories were small rooms created under staircases or behind false panels. Others were old storage spaces repurposed into workshops. One might have a shelf carved high above eye level, reachable only by climbing onto a table. Another might contain a furnace built from mismatched stones, scavenged from ruined buildings. The details varied, but the purpose remained the same, to create a place where experiments could continue free from interruption. The secrecy was not merely panic. It was discipline, shaped by years of knowing how quickly suspicion could transform into accusation. The narrator reveals that traces of these hidden rooms linger today only in fragments. A letter written by a monk mentions a lower chamber without explanation. An estate inventory lists a locked storage room with no description of its contents. A later renovation uncovers a small space sealed behind plaster, containing little more than broken pottery and a piece of rusted iron shaped like part of a furnace. These discoveries raise more questions than answers. Why was the room sealed? Who used it? What happened to the person who once worked there? Historians can guess, but certainty remains elusive. As the story unfolds, the listener is guided through the subtle thrill of imagining these forgotten spaces. A corridor in an old abbey leads to a wall that differs slightly in texture, hinting at a doorway bricked over long ago. A castle tower holds a spiral staircase that stops one level too soon, suggesting a missing floor. A noble house contains a cellar whose layout seems asymmetrical, as though one room was deliberately omitted from all records. These architectural anomalies become whispered evidence of alchemists who moved their most dangerous work away from sight. Every missing line in a blueprint feels like an invitation to wonder, yet the narrator remains careful not to slip into fantasy. These laboratories were small, practical spaces, not elaborate underground cities. Their purpose was not dramatic rebellion but simple continuity. The alchemists who built them did so because they believed their work mattered enough to protect. They felt responsible for ideas that might be misunderstood or destroyed if left in open view. The sense of erasure surrounding these rooms that appear only in hints, rooms that burned in fires, rooms collapsed by war feeds the unsettling idea that entire laboratories might have vanished without anyone realizing what disappeared with them. Imagine walking through a building 5 centuries after its walls echoed with quiet experimentation. You run your fingers along a cold stone surface and sense a faint irregularity, a subtle ridge beneath layers of dust. Was there once a door here? Did a hand push against this stone as someone slipped inside, carrying a jar filled with shimmering liquid? These small details allow the mind to wander, imagining the hum of a hidden furnace, the rustle of parchment covered in coded script, the soft clink of glass vessels arranged in the half-light. For viewers who love exploring abandoned buildings or discovering hidden rooms, this section taps into an instinct older than any medieval pursuit. The desire to uncover what has been concealed, to imagine footsteps echoing in forgotten hallways, connects them emotionally to the alchemist's life. They recognize that secrecy is not just protection, it is a way of creating spaces where unapproved ideas can survive. The hidden laboratories become symbols of a habit that endures across centuries. When knowledge seems too dangerous for public view, it seeks the shelter of quiet rooms. As the narrator lingers on these images of lost spaces, the tone softens, preparing the listener for the shift to the next question. These laboratories were not built for convenience. They were built out of need. And when a person constructs a hidden room, buries a furnace, and shields their work from the world, one question rises like smoke from a sealed chimney. Why? What purpose drove them to risk so much in pursuit of experiments no one else could see? Hidden rooms create hidden thoughts. Once an alchemist stepped away from public workshops and descended into a secret chamber, something in the mind shifted. The walls no longer listened. The door no longer creaked with the footsteps of priests or patrons. The quiet became deeper, almost heavy, and in that stillness a different kind of thinking emerged. Away from the pressure to produce dyes, medicines, or hopeful metals, the alchemist could finally entertain the ideas he dared not speak aloud. The secret spaces we glimpsed earlier were not only laboratories of matter, they were laboratories of imagination, places where the forbidden could take shape in whispered sentences and half-written notes. And the narrator guides us gently into that mental terrain, where the boundaries between refining metals and refining creation itself began to blur. Inside these sealed rooms, illuminated only by the trembling glow of a covered flame, the alchemist wrote differently. Margins filled with fragments of language no patron would understand. A phrase such as renewal of the entire world appeared beside notes about the color of heated minerals. Another entry described an experiment as the beginning of a purified creation, even though the materials involved were nothing more than ash, salt, and oil. These were not public declarations. They were murmurs of an inner belief, ideas allowed to surface only when the alchemist felt entirely unseen. And the language itself suggested an expanding ambition, something stretching far beyond wealth, healing, or practical discovery. The narrator reminds the listener that we cannot claim these lines as evidence of literal plans. Medieval writing often blended metaphors with observations, and the alchemical tradition thrived on imagery. Yet when we look across dozens of manuscripts, across centuries of marginalia and tiny scrawled symbols, a pattern emerges too consistent to ignore. The imagery grows apocalyptic. The metaphors grow cosmic. The intentions, even when wrapped in spiritual language, become startlingly large. Many alchemists compared their furnaces to the fires at the beginning of time. Many spoke of metals returning to a state before corruption, a phrase that sounded less like chemistry and more like a longing for a world cleansed of imperfection. And then the narrator adds a soft but striking twist. Perhaps some church critics were not imagining threats. Perhaps they sensed, more clearly than modern readers, that these alchemists were thinking about creation itself. The priests who warned their congregations about those who seek to imitate God's power may not have been speaking metaphorically. When an inquisitor saw a symbol of a rising sun drawn inside concentric circles, he might have recognized a pattern older than the alchemist realized, a hint of a worldview that treated reality as something malleable, something that could be restarted. In that light, suspicion did not seem paranoid, it seemed perceptive. Within the secret rooms, the alchemist felt free to push ideas further. He imagined matter dissolving into its first state, the world returning to a purer condition, a new beginning unfolding after some unnamed ending. He was afraid of the corruption he saw around him: plague, famine, sudden death, unexplained signs in the sky. If matter could be refined, if metals could be transformed, if substances could pass through fire and emerge improved, then why could the world not follow the same pattern? The step from repairing substances to repairing reality did not appear vast. It appeared natural, logical, even compassionate. The narrator allows the listener to linger on that thought. What does a person dream when he believes the world is wounded? When he feels the fabric of existence is fraying? When he sees suffering everywhere and holds, in his small hidden furnace, a symbol of how impurities might be burned away? The alchemist did not imagine himself a destroyer. He imagined himself a healer. And yet healing, on a cosmic scale, would require an ending. Renewal always demands a return to the beginning. In this sense, the alchemist's metaphors became dangerously close to doctrines reserved for divine power. This is where the idea of a rival genesis slips into the narrative with quiet force. The alchemist was not trying to write a new scripture, but in describing processes that mirrored creation, heat, separation, purification, emergence, he risked stepping into sacred territory. To refine matter was one thing, to refine existence was another. The very shape of his thoughts, the structure of his metaphors, implied a type of authorship, and authorship over creation was not allowed. Religious authorities sensed this, perhaps more intuitively than historically documented. Their warnings reflected a discomfort with anyone who believed the world could be shaped by human hands. The alchemist, meanwhile, sensed that speaking openly about such thoughts would bring ruin. This dual awareness created a strange dance of silence and suspicion. Both sides feared something immense. Both sensed that the other stood near a line neither dared to cross. And the audience watching this documentary, awake late at night, feels the tension with a quiet thrill. They understand that forbidden knowledge becomes most compelling when both the seeker and the gatekeeper fear the same possibility. The narrator steps back, inviting the viewer to consider the complexity of these opposing forces. The church was not merely oppressive, it was protective of an order it believed was fragile. The alchemist was not merely reckless, he was searching for meaning in a world that seemed always on the edge of collapse. Their conflict was not simple, it was rooted in shared anxieties about creation, destruction, and the future of existence. This reframing allows the story to feel richer, less like a tale of villains and heroes, and more like a meeting of worldviews struggling to understand the same mystery from opposite sides. As the hidden laboratories darken, the alchemist's ambitions become clearer. He was not chasing only gold. Gold was a symbol, a metaphor, a step. He was chasing transformation at every scale. He wondered about the perfection of matter, the endurance of the body, the shape of time. He imagined cycles larger than kingdoms, larger than scriptures, larger than anything recorded in the books he copied by candlelight. His furnace was not simply a tool, it was a model of the universe. The narrator softens the final lines of the chapter, guiding the listener toward what comes next. If alchemists dared to imagine new beginnings, then we must ask what exactly they pursued. Gold was only the most visible goal. Beneath it lay dreams of immortality, of perfected bodies, of a world restored and something stranger still, a desire to influence time itself. And so the story moves forward, leaving the secret rooms behind, stepping toward the ambitions that waited at the heart of the great work. Gold has always held a strange position in the human imagination. It gleams even in dim light, resists rust, refuses to tarnish, and seems to stand apart from the great cycle of decay that claims almost everything else. In the medieval world, where wood warped, iron corroded, and bread spoiled within days, gold appeared almost supernatural. It did not crumble with age. It did not absorb the world's corruption. It remained, stubbornly, itself. For many alchemists, this quiet defiance of time carried a meaning deeper than wealth. Gold became a symbol of victory over the forces that ruled every living thing, aging, rot, and death. And so, when the narrator returns to the image of gold and the philosopher's stone, it is with a shift in perspective. Gold is no longer the reward, it is the question. Inside cramped workshops and hidden chambers, alchemists spent countless hours trying to coax ordinary metals into something more perfect. Lead softened, mercury shimmered. Copper deepened into reds like the glow of a sunset. Each transformation felt like a conversation with matter itself, as though the universe might reveal a secret if they listened closely enough. They heated, mixed, dissolved, and purified, each step reflecting an unspoken desire to discover how anything could escape the reach of time. Gold did not decay. If they could understand why, then perhaps they could apply that principle to other forms of existence. The narrator guides the listener through descriptions of these modest, almost tender experiments. A piece of iron placed in a bath of acid slowly surrendered to corrosion. A strip of copper, exposed to damp air, darkened within days. But a tiny nugget of gold, left on the same table, remained untouched. Its surface shone, as though time itself had slipped around it like water around a stone. To the alchemist, this was not simply a curiosity, it was a provocation. If the natural world allowed for one substance immune to decay, then immunity was possible, and if immunity was possible, perhaps it could be expanded. Many alchemical texts describe the search for perfected gold, a state beyond even the gold found in nature. This perfected form was imagined as the result of purification so complete that the metal would embody permanence in its highest form. Some manuscripts claim such gold would shine with a light that never dimmed. Others claim it would remain unchanged through fire, water, or the passage of ages. The pursuit of this substance was not simply a technical challenge, it was a spiritual one. To perfect gold was to declare war on the slow, inevitable dissolving of all things. The narrator introduces a deeper layer of meaning by pointing to certain phrases that appear again and again in alchemical writings. One of the most evocative is the call to fix the volatile. In practical terms, this meant stabilizing substances that evaporated, rotted, or dissolved. But metaphorically, the phrase became far larger. Fix the volatile. Bind what slips away. Hold fast what time tries to scatter. The alchemist read these words and saw a path towards stopping the clock, even if only for a moment, even if only for a tiny speck of matter. The goal was not immortality yet. It was something smaller and more attainable, creating a stable point in a world of constant motion. But once someone creates one stable point, once a person glimpses the possibility of holding something outside the flow of time, a different question naturally follows. Could the same logic apply to the human body? Could it apply to the mind? Could it apply to history itself? The narrator lets this idea unfurl slowly, like smoke curling upward from a flame. The step from fixing metals to fixing reality no longer seems absurd. It seems like an extension of the same line of thought, carried further and further until it brushes against forbidden territory. Some manuscripts hint at this ambition indirectly. They describe substances that endure beyond all seasons, mixtures that resist corruption, and essences that preserve the nature of that which they touch. Though the language is poetic, the desire beneath it is clear. The alchemist wanted to escape the collapse that awaited every living creature. He wanted to capture endurance itself, and gold, perfect and unchanged, became the mirror for that dream. The narrator weaves in subtle images of the alchemist at work, staring into a glowing crucible, his face lit by a quiet determination. He watches metals shift from solid to liquid, from dull to gleaming, as though witnessing the world's hidden rules made visible. In those moments, he senses the possibility of stopping decay, even if only within the boundaries of his workshop. The world outside grows older by the hour. Bread spoils, roofs sag, bodies weaken. But inside the furnace, under the right conditions, something can remain untouched. This contrast between the fragile world and the unchanging nugget of gold became the emotional core of many alchemical pursuits. The narrator invites the listener to feel the pull of that contrast, to imagine holding a piece of matter that defies the law governing every heartbeat, every season, every empire. Gold's stillness became a direct challenge to time's authority. It was as though the universe had left behind a clue, a reminder that not everything must decay. And then comes the twist. Manuscripts describing fixing the volatile often drift into language that sounds almost cosmological. If the fleeting can be made stable, what else can be altered? Could an age be fixed? Could a cycle be halted? Could the sweeping march of history, with its plagues and wars and collapses, be paused or reset? The narrator leaves these questions open, inviting the viewer to sit with the idea that the alchemist's small experiments were rehearsals for something far larger in imagination, if not in practice. For modern listeners fascinated by anti-aging research, cryonics, digital uploads, or the pursuit of biological immortality, this medieval struggle feels strangely familiar. The alchemist's fear of decay mirrors contemporary anxieties. His longing for endurance echoes modern dreams of beating time. The tools differ, the furnace becomes the laboratory, the crucible becomes the petri dish, but the desire remains ancient. As the section nears its end, the narrator draws a soft closing arc. Gold defies time. The alchemist's quest to perfect it becomes a quest to perfect existence. And this desire naturally leads to the next stage of the story. If metals can be purified and enduring substances crafted, then what of elixirs and mysterious stones? What of mixtures said to transform not only matter but the human body itself? The path forward is clear. To understand the alchemist's war with time, we must step from the furnace to the cup, from perfected metals to the elixirs that promised something even stranger. In the quiet hours when the furnace dimmed and the world outside faded into darkness, the alchemist often turned his thoughts toward the strangest promises in his tradition. Elixirs that could heal any wound, powders that prolonged life, and above all, the elusive philosopher's stone. These were not whimsical fantasies to him. They were symbols of a final, perfect refinement, the theoretical endpoint of everything he attempted in his cramped workshop. The narrator guides the listener through these ideas with gentle care, showing how they emerged not from dreams of sorcery, but from a logical extension of the alchemist's daily observations. If metals could be purified, perhaps bodies could be purified as well. If matter could be perfected, perhaps life itself could be drawn toward that same flawless state. Descriptions of such substances varied wildly from manuscript to manuscript. Some spoke of a red powder that glowed like embers, capable of transforming even the most stubborn metal into shimmering gold. Others told of a translucent stone, no larger than a thumb, that shimmered with shifting colors as though holding dawn and dusk within its core. A few described elixirs that tasted like nothing on earth, mixtures said to renew the strength of the weary and restore failing organs. But the narrator emphasizes that these accounts were not meant to be taken as literal inventories. They were attempts to describe the indescribable, to hint at a level of transformation beyond the reach of ordinary language. The alchemist imagined the process required to create such a substance as the ultimate refinement of both matter and mind. It would not be achieved through a single experiment, but through a lifetime of patient work dissolving, recombining, heating, cooling, observing, and starting again. Each failure felt like a step in a long, spiraling ascent. The stone, or the elixir, represented the summit of that spiraling path. It was not only a material goal, but a philosophical one. It promised harmony between the physical and the spiritual, between the visible world and the hidden forces believed to shape it. The narrator describes how the power attributed to these perfected substances always followed the same pattern, turning flawed things into perfect things. A sick body could be restored. A corrupted metal could be purified. A decaying object could be renewed. The logic was simple but profound. If matter could return to its purest state, perhaps everything touched by time could be brought back to a state before it began to weaken. This idea did not necessarily promise immortality. Instead, it promised repair, a return to the moment when decay had not yet begun. For the alchemist, watching impurities burn away inside his furnace, this idea became intoxicating. Each transformation he witnessed felt like a message. When base metals brightened after long heating, when dark mixtures clarified into something unexpectedly luminous, he saw reflections of what life itself might accomplish under the right conditions. If a metal could rise above its limitations, why not a human being? Why not the world? The narrator allows these thoughts to unfold slowly, inviting the listener to feel the same quiet hope that must have stirred inside the alchemist's chest. And then comes the subtle, wait, what, moment of the section. Some texts describe the philosopher's stone not as an object, but as a state. They speak of a union of heaven and earth, of time and matter, woven together so completely that nothing can be divided anymore. In these passages, the stone ceases to be a thing one could hold. It becomes an achieved condition, a perfected alignment in which all opposites reconcile. For a rare handful of alchemists, reaching this state implied something far greater than healing a body or refining gold. It suggested the possibility of influencing the entire structure of existence. The narrator treats this idea with softness, as though brushing dust from an ancient page. The alchemist may not have intended to create a rival version of Genesis, but his metaphors lean toward beginnings. When he wrote of the first matter, of the original unity, of the birth of perfected creation, he gestured toward forces usually reserved for divine hands. If the stone unified all things, it might unify all eras as well. If the elixir restored life, it might restore ages. For someone who believed time moved in cycles of corruption and renewal, the perfected substance could become more than a cure. It could become a catalyst. The narrator leads the audience deeper into this implication. Imagine a mind steeped in the belief that the world had fallen from an earlier perfection. Imagine that same mind discovering a principle that seemed capable of reversing decline. The temptation would be enormous. To restore purity not only to metal but to existence itself. To heal not only the body, but the age. The elixirs and stones become symbols of a much broader imagination, a longing to touch the hinges of reality. But the narrator is careful to avoid sensationalism. These ambitions did not mean the alchemist wished to overthrow creation. They reflected instead a profound yearning for harmony, for a universe no longer fractured by rot or chaos. His hidden laboratory, with its sealed shelves and trembling light, became a place where he rehearsed not only the manipulation of matter, but the rescue of everything he felt slipping away. The stone, as an idea, allowed him to picture a world repaired at its deepest level. For modern listeners fascinated by ultimate keys, master algorithms, or hidden codes that promise to solve everything, this medieval pursuit feels strangely familiar. The philosopher's stone becomes an ancestor of those obsessions, an imagined point at which knowledge merges into power, and power merges into transformation. It satisfies the desire to believe that somewhere, somehow, there exists a principle that ties all mysteries together. As the narrator guides the section toward its end, the tone softens again. The alchemist stares at a small vessel cooling on his table, hoping its contents hold even a fraction of the perfection he imagines. The furnace crackles. The night deepens. His heartbeat aligns with the slow expansion and contraction of the flame. He believes that if he can refine matter to its purest state, he may unlock the secret that binds time, body, and world into one. And then the narrator poses the thought that prepares the transition to the next chapter. If a substance or state existed that could unify all things, if perfection were possible even for a moment, then someone might wonder whether it had ever been achieved before. Whether some forgotten age had reached completion and used that power to reset the world. Whether the traces of such a moment survived only in symbols that the alchemist now chased. The question lingers in the air like cooling smoke. Has the process ever been completed? And if so, what followed? As the narrator returns to the idea of cycles and resets, the atmosphere grows quieter, as though the story itself is holding its breath. Everything introduced in earlier chapters, gold that refuses to decay, substances imagined to perfect matter, the elusive stone that hints at unity begins to converge. For many alchemists, these symbols were not isolated quests. They blurred together into a single possibility. If matter could be purified, perhaps the world could be purified as well. The same principles that transformed metals might, in a more extraordinary vision, transform ages. And so the narrator invites the listener to drift back into the alchemist's dim workshop, imagining him staring into a glowing crucible and wondering whether the refinement he seeks might reach far beyond its fragile walls. Inside marginal notes and coded phrases, the alchemist left clues that his ambitions were not limited to gold or medicine. Some diagrams resemble strange wheels, divided into seasons or epochs, as though charting cycles far larger than a human lifespan. Others show furnaces drawn beneath symbols of the heavens, suggesting that earthly fire might echo celestial transformations. The narrator does not claim that these drawings prove anything, but rather that they reveal a way of thinking. If everything in nature could be reduced to its first matter and rebuilt, then why should that logic stop at the workshop door? The great work, in its most ambitious interpretation, might be nothing less than the refinement of the entire creation. Through this lens, the alchemist's pursuit becomes a meditation on decay, why it begins, how it spreads, and whether it can be reversed. To him, corruption was not merely moral but material. Wood rotted, iron rusted, kingdoms collapsed, winters returned with grim predictability. If the world was constructed from the same substances he melted and stirred, then perhaps its patterns of decline followed the same rules. The narrator gently leads the listener into the alchemist's inner reasoning. If decay can be reversed in a single piece of matter, then perhaps, in theory, decay could be reversed on a grander scale. Renew a piece of copper, renew a body, renew an age. The leap is bold, but within his worldview, it is strangely logical. Yet the narrator also exposes the unsettling side of this thought. Purification, in the furnace, is not polite. Impurities do not politely step aside. They are burned away, dissolved, or discarded. When the alchemist removes dross from molten metal, he does not negotiate with it. It hisses, darkens, and dies. If this process is applied metaphorically to the world, it carries disturbing implications. What, in the alchemist's imagined reset, counted as impurity? What would be burned away? His texts rarely say. They glide over the question with symbols and metaphors, leaving a silence more unnerving than any explanation. The narrator lingers in that silence, allowing the listener to feel the tension between hope and fear. On one side lies the longing for renewal, a world without corruption, without plague, without collapse, a world restored to its first purity. On the other side lies the terrifying possibility that such purification might come at a cost no one could survive. Would ordinary people be transformed into something perfect? Or would they be consumed like dross in the crucible? The alchemist may not have fully confronted these questions, but they hover in the margins of his work, as unavoidable as the shadows cast by his furnace flame. There is a haunting beauty in the idea that the world could be renewed, that history might not be a single downward slope, but a cycle of birth, decay, and rebirth. Ancient myths hinted at this pattern. Golden ages followed by dark ones, worlds drowned or burned before rising anew. The alchemist, reading fragments of those stories and combining them with his own observations, may have felt that he stood on the edge of a vast inheritance. The stone, the elixir, the great work, these were not merely tools but symbols of a cosmic rhythm. In completing the work, he imagined aligning himself with that rhythm, perhaps even guiding it. But the narrator draws the listener deeper, pointing out that the alchemist's imagined reset was more intimate than the legends. It did not require gods hurling fire or floods swallowing continents. Instead, it began in a single room, with a single pair of hands, shaping matter grain by grain. The scale of the transformation did not lessen the personal nature of the task. In fact, it heightened it. This was not a divine storm but a human endeavor, a private attempt to mend existence using the same principles that mended metals. If the world truly cycled through ages, then perhaps a determined mind could help shepherd it from corruption to renewal. Still, the narrator does not shy away from the darker possibility embedded within this dream. To reset the world requires acknowledging that something fundamental must end. To purify is to destroy what cannot be perfected. The alchemist, in chasing renewal, may have been flirting with ideas that no individual should entertain. His furnace became a miniature model of creation and destruction, a rehearsal for forces far beyond his control. The listener is encouraged to sense the weight of this, to realize that the line between healing and erasing is perilously thin. In the late hours of the night, when the alchemist paused over his notes, he may have sensed these contradictions. He may have wondered whether he sought salvation or ruin, and whether the difference between the two was smaller than he wished to believe. Yet he continued, compelled by a belief that the world could be restored to a younger, purer form. The narrator allows this image to settle gently, inviting the audience to recognize the same impulse within themselves, the desire to wipe away corruption, to begin again, even if the cost remains unspoken. For viewers who enjoy exploring grand theories without confronting their darker implications, this section offers a quiet challenge. It suggests that every dream of a reset carries a shadow. The alchemist's imagined purification holds promise and peril in equal measure, and the listener is left to sit with the question that shaped his work. Would you still wish for a purified world if you knew you might be the impurity burned away? With that question lingering, the narrator softens the tone for the transition. The alchemist's ideas, whether hopeful or dangerous, did not remain trapped in his workshop. If anyone ever tried to move from theory to action, traces of that attempt might still lie hidden in obscure manuscripts, forgotten ruins, or unexplained events whispered through history. And so the story prepares to shift. With the stakes now clear, the next chapter asks what evidence remains and what might have vanished without a trace. There are moments in history when silence speaks louder than anything preserved. As the narrator guides the listener into this new chapter, the focus shifts from what survived to what disappeared. Instead of dusty shelves filled with manuscripts, we begin with the shelves that stand empty. Instead of the familiar glow of a workshop fire, we start with the cold remains of buildings that once housed knowledge now lost to time. The tone grows softer, almost mournful, as though the story is entering a room where voices should echo but do not. It is here, in absence, that the strange shape of alchemy's forgotten past becomes most visible. Across medieval Europe, monasteries once kept collections of curious books that blended philosophy, astronomy, theology, and the early chemistry that slowly evolved from alchemy's remains. Some monasteries held dozens of these works, others kept only a handful. What they shared was vulnerability. A single fire could erase an entire lineage of thought. A single reform could deem certain ideas unacceptable. And so the narrator gently recounts tales of libraries destroyed by invading armies, accidental blazes, political uprisings, and sweeping religious changes. These events were not targeted at alchemy alone, yet alchemical materials often vanished in disproportionate numbers. The listener is invited to consider what that means. Among surviving inventories lists, written by careful monks trying to record the knowledge they protected, we occasionally find titles that no longer match any known manuscript. The narrator reads these entries with a quiet, haunting rhythm. Treatise on the cycles of the firmament, Book of Renewed Creation, Commentary on the First Matter and Final Age. These fragments are all that remain, lines on pages now separated from their lost counterparts by centuries. They hint at themes of world ages, cosmic resets, and transformations far grander than metallic refinements. The manuscripts themselves are gone, but the shadows they cast linger long enough to stir curiosity. The narrator describes these gaps with care, avoiding sensationalism while preserving the sense of mystery. Some inventories mention that certain books were removed for safety. Others say they were locked away or withdrawn from ordinary circulation. A few include chilling comments like, not suitable for common study or containing speculations improper for the faithful. No explanations follow. The books vanish from later records, as if they slipped through cracks in history. The listener is encouraged to imagine a monk crossing out a title with a trembling hand, knowing he would never see the manuscript again. War, too, played its role. Many collections were destroyed simply because they stood in the wrong place at the wrong moment. Flames did not discriminate, but the aftermath sometimes did. When rebuilding began, certain types of books were quietly omitted. The narrator paints a picture of scholars sifting through ashes, finding fragments of parchment fused by heat, unable to tell what knowledge had been lost forever. This is not presented as a conspiracy, only as a reminder of how fragile written memory can be. Yet the pattern remains. Alchemy suffered disproportionately from this fragility. Then comes the wait, what moment. There are documented cases where alchemical texts were singled out for destruction, while other manuscripts, histories, sermons, herbals, poems were carefully rescued. In one instance, a small monastic library was purged of works described as dangerously speculative, even though they stood beside volumes containing far more questionable theological debates. In another, a bishop ordered that certain books be burned before they corrupt the imagination of the unwary, yet his inventory does not specify what the corruption concerned. Only the category survives: alchemical treatises. The narrator does not claim to know why these decisions were made. Instead, the story allows room for questions to bloom in the listener's mind. Were these texts simply associated with unpopular ideas? Were they deemed irrelevant? Or were they removed because they contained concepts that challenged the boundaries of what institutions believed should be permitted? The uncertainty becomes part of the experience. The absence itself becomes the mystery. Beyond institutional destruction, there are quieter disappearances that feel more accidental but no less intriguing. Some manuscripts drifted into private hands, acquired by nobles or wealthy patrons who prized exotic knowledge. These collectors sometimes hid their books from rivals, family, or even the church. When estates were divided, the manuscripts vanished into trunks, secret compartments, or forgotten rooms. Renovations covered doorways, dust-buried boxes. Centuries passed. Somewhere, perhaps, a few of those books remain bricked behind a wall or sealed beneath a staircase, their pages asleep in darkness. The narrator lets this possibility settle like a whisper. Another layer of loss comes from deliberate self-erasure. Alchemists themselves occasionally destroyed their own work. Some feared misunderstanding, others worried about accusations of heresy. A few believed that certain ideas were too potent to be left in the open. The narrator imagines a solitary figure feeding pages into a small flame, watching years of labor curl into smoke. Not out of malice, but out of caution. He believed his insights should not survive him, or should survive only in cryptic form. Throughout the section, the narrator repeats one phrase in different forms. We know far more about what we lost than what we have. The pattern becomes clear. The alchemical tradition we study today is incomplete, shaped not by what survived, but by what vanished. It is like a constellation missing half its stars. We map the darkness as much as the light. The listener, lying in their own dark room, may feel a faint kinship with this absence. The missing pieces invite imagination in a way that completed puzzles never do. As the section draws toward its conclusion, the narrator emphasizes one final, haunting detail. In several medieval catalogues, some alchemical works were marked not only as lost but as deliberately suppressed. The language is vague phrases like, not to be copied, or removed from the record. No further explanation is offered. The effect is unnerving. A sense that behind the everyday losses of war and fire, there were also moments of quiet intention. Someone decided certain ideas should not survive. Someone took steps to ensure they faded into silence. With the listener now immersed in these echoes and absences, the narrator prepares the transition to the next section. If libraries vanish, the story says, traces of their contents might still survive elsewhere in letters, in marginal notes, in rumors, or in the curious distortions that occur when forbidden knowledge tries to survive through whispers rather than books. The next step, naturally, is to follow those echoes wherever they lead. To understand what has vanished, the narrator explains, we must look not at the books themselves, but at the faint shadows they left behind, references scattered across letters, reports, and small complaints written by people who never intended to preserve history. These echo documents, as the narrator gently names them, form a strange chorus around the missing works. None offer a full picture. Each is incomplete, but together they create the outline of a world that once existed behind locked doors and shuttered windows. The listener is invited into this subtle form of investigation, like someone paging through old drawers in a forgotten house, finding traces of someone who slipped away without warning. The narrator begins with letters exchanged between patrons and alchemists. Some are polite requests for progress updates. Others grow impatient, even accusatory. A nobleman writes, "Your work must proceed with greater caution," a phrase that hints at danger without explaining it. Another patron warns, "Do not attempt the last procedure without guidance, for it troubles the heavens." These letters do not name the missing books, but they orbit them. They reference that manuscript you received from Lombardy, or the treatise with diagrams inappropriate for public record. The listener realizes that the most revealing details appear not in the books themselves, but in the way people reacted to them. Next, the narrator turns to complaints from neighbors, small legal documents, petitions, and notes scribbled by frustrated townsfolk. Their tone is mundane, even irritated, yet the details fall into uncanny patterns. One neighbor complains about nocturnal lights not of any candle I know, while another describes hearing a humming like a hive under the floorboards. A report to a city official mentions thick smoke with no smell of burning wood, and another claims the walls shook at midnight with no storm to blame. These echoes do not prove anything, but they sketch a mood around the lost laboratories. Experiments that stretched beyond normal craft, disturbing those who lived nearby. Then the narrator introduces reports from church officials, documents that tread carefully between curiosity and suspicion. Some describe unsettling doctrines appearing in the margins of alchemical texts. Others reference erroneous beliefs about the renewal of the age, or speculations on the appointed order of time. These phrases are vague, yet each feels like a glimpse into a larger argument that was never written down. A few reports mention specific alchemists who possessed dangerous manuscripts that must not be copied, suggesting the presence of works that scholars considered unacceptable long before they disappeared. The narrator avoids sensationalism, allowing listeners to draw their own conclusions from these incomplete threads. The story then shifts to hypothetical reconstructions, clearly labelled as such. The narrator imagines an alchemist receiving a damaged manuscript from a travelling scholar, examining its diagrams, and recognizing something that frightened him. We picture him writing cautiously to a patron, hinting at ideas too enormous to articulate plainly. Another reconstruction imagines a church scribe reading a strange commentary, marking only the phrase speculative doctrines, unable or unwilling to describe more. These reconstructions do not claim to reveal what truly happened, but they show how easily world-shifting ideas could slip through the cracks of recorded history, leaving only trembling sentences behind. The wait, what? Moment arrives when the narrator reveals another pattern hidden among these echoes: sudden endings. In several collections of letters, an alchemist writes regularly to a patron, detailed progress notes, polite reassurances, requests for supplies, and then stops without explanation. The patron's replies grow increasingly puzzled. "Why do you not answer?" one asks. "Have you abandoned the work?" Another writes, "I cannot understand your silence. Send word of your health," yet no further letters follow. The correspondence goes dark, as though the alchemist stepped out of his life mid-sentence. Neighbours, too, mention abrupt changes. One describes how the noises ceased in early spring, with a scribbled note wondering whether the alchemist finally achieved something or gave up in despair. A church investigator writes that a workshop, previously the subject of complaints, was suddenly found cold, empty, and without trace of its occupant. No sign of struggle, no sign of packing. The tools left in place, as if the alchemist walked away for a moment and never returned. The narrator lets these details settle slowly, allowing listeners to imagine the possibilities without claiming any definitive answer. A few echo documents hint at troubling events inside the labs themselves. An assistant complains of a brightness that hurt the sight, while a servant mentions a glass vessel bursting with such force that the door rattled. A short parish record notes that an alchemist ceased his studies after a frightful happening, though it does not describe what occurred. Another mentions a monk visiting the workshop and insisting that the work must not continue, after which the alchemist retired from inquiry and spoke no more of his previous pursuits. These fragments feel like footprints left at the edge of a forest, showing where someone walked, but not where they went. The narrator acknowledges that such clues can be interpreted in many ways. Perhaps these alchemists simply faced financial ruin, personal loss, or a change in belief. But the pattern of sudden silence, disconnected from war, plague, or known catastrophe, suggests something else. Something happened inside those workshops that was not recorded, either because it was too strange, too dangerous, or too incomprehensible for words. The listener is invited to reflect on how often the most important events leave the fewest traces. As the section deepens, the narrator reflects on the limits of echo documents. They offer only impressions, worries, warnings, misunderstandings, glimpses of ideas never fully explained. They allow us to build a silhouette of someone we cannot see clearly. We can sense the intensity of their work, the unease of those around them, and the gravity of ideas hinted at, but never openly stated. But we cannot know their intentions. We cannot know how close they came to success or disaster. We cannot know what they feared, or what they discovered, in those final moments when the letters stopped. Yet the narrator makes one thing clear: these echoes, faint as they are, carry emotional weight. They suggest that the alchemists lived with pressures and terrors that rarely appear in official histories. Their work existed on the margins, and when something went wrong or something extraordinary occurred, it often slipped into silence rather than documentation. The listener feels the texture of that silence. It is thick, uneasy, and strangely alive. As the section nears its end, the narrator returns to the pattern of abrupt endings. Someone working with volatile substances might stop after an accident. Someone facing official scrutiny might abandon their pursuit. Someone discovering a principle they feared could be misused might destroy their notes and vanish from their correspondents' lives. These possibilities hover in the air, unresolved. And from that mystery comes the transition. If the echoes speak of sudden endings and unexplained silences, the narrator asks softly, then what happened inside those laboratories to bring such abrupt halts? What did they see, attempt, or unleash that drove them into secrecy or into disappearance? The story turns toward the next question. What lay behind those final, unrecorded moments? The narrator approaches this section with a hush, as though stepping into a room where something unsettling once occurred. What happened inside those vanished laboratories? Why did some alchemists stop writing, stop answering letters, or abandon their workshops without warning? The story resists the temptation to leap into fantasy. Instead, it stays close to documented dangers, fumes that clouded the lungs, metals that released invisible poisons, vessels that shattered with enough force to blind or scar. These hazards alone were enough to end careers, or lives. But woven within these plausible perils are darker possibilities, hinted at in echo documents and nervous marginal notes. The narrator begins with the most grounded explanation. Early chemistry was perilous. Alchemists heated mercury in cramped rooms, inhaled arsenic dust, and mixed substances that reacted violently with moisture or air. Their equipment was fragile. Thin glass retorts that could explode under pressure, clay furnaces that cracked from uneven heating, hearths that burned too hot or too long. Many alchemists suffered chronic illness, tremors, headaches, strange hallucinations from prolonged exposure to toxic vapors. Some likely died without understanding the cause. These dangers were real, and they explain why some workshops fell silent abruptly. But the narrator does not stop there. He leans into the grey area between what is known and what is feared. What if an experiment meant to purify? A metal produced something unexpected, strange residues that behaved oddly, or substances that glowed faintly even after the furnace cooled. Early manuscripts mention powders that shone without flame, liquids that moved as though with intention, or sediments that stank of corruption, though no animal was present. These descriptions are inconsistent, often metaphorical, but they suggest moments when matter seemed to step outside familiar boundaries. The narrator lingers on one such account. A letter from a frightened assistant describes a brightness that had no source, appearing above a crucible before vanishing. Another document mentions a shadow on the wall that did not match the motion of the flame. These could be exaggerations, or the result of toxic hallucinations. Yet the narrator notes that they occur often enough to form a pattern, brief encounters with effects that felt unnatural to those who witnessed them. As the listener grows more attentive, the story introduces the possibility of unintended biological effects. One neighbor complained that his animals refused to eat after a night of strange odors drifting from the alchemist's house. Another report notes plants near a workshop turning pale, as if drained of color. Again, there are grounded explanations. Heavy metals in the soil, contaminated water, smoke filled with corrosive compounds. But to someone who believed matter, spirit, and time were intertwined, these small disturbances may have felt like signs that the experiment had reached too far. The narrator then explores psychological consequences. Long nights, isolation, malnutrition, and toxic exposure could erode the mind. Voices in the smoke, figures glimpsed in the corner of the eye, sudden conviction that one was on the edge of revelation. These symptoms can arise from exhaustion and chemical exposure. Yet for an alchemist who believed he was manipulating the foundation of existence, such experiences might be interpreted as glimpses of deeper truths. Perhaps some believed they had touched something real, something vast, before recoiling in terror. This brings the listener to the most delicate part of the section, the possibility that an alchemist, driven by the idea of cycles and resets, might have interpreted a strange, uncontrolled reaction as proof that the boundary between the present world and a purified state was thinner than expected. Imagine a moment when a vessel cracked and a vapor poured out, moving unnaturally in the air. Imagine a color appearing in the flame that the alchemist had never seen before. Imagine a sudden change in the room's atmosphere, a silence, a pressure, a sensation that made the heart race. For someone who believed the world could be melted down and recast, any unusual effect might feel like a brush against that terrifying potential. The narrator suggests that such a moment, real or imagined, could have been enough to halt the work entirely. Not because the experiment failed, but because it seemed to succeed in a way the alchemist could not control. If purification was a form of destruction, if the reset of matter mirrored the reset of worlds, then even a hint of that force might have been overwhelming. A single unexplained reaction could convince an alchemist that he had opened a door best left closed. From the echo documents, we know some alchemists abruptly destroyed their notes. Others disappeared from correspondence without farewell. A few returned to ordinary trades, medicine, teaching, or clerical work, never mentioning their former pursuits again. One letter describes a scholar who would not enter his workshop after the incident, though the nature of the incident is left unstated. Another warns that the procedure should never again be attempted, with no further explanation. These silences are more chilling than any detailed account. They suggest fear beyond words. The narrator invites listeners to imagine what might cause a complete retreat. Not a bang, but a whisper. Not a catastrophe others witnessed, but a private realization that something had gone wrong or right in a way too dangerous to pursue. A vessel glowing after the fire was extinguished. A mixture behaving contrary to known principles. A sensation of time stretching or contracting in the mind of a sleepless experimenter. Grounded possibilities blend with speculative shadows, leaving listeners suspended between the two. The narrator remains careful, never insisting on supernatural conclusions. The power of the story lies in the ambiguity. Plausible accidents can inspire impossible fears. Real toxins can produce visions that feel like revelations. Misunderstood reactions can appear to break the rules of nature. The alchemist's worldview, shaped by cycles, purification, and the dream of renewal, provided fertile ground for terror when something unexpected occurred. The listener is left to wonder how many breakthroughs were abandoned because the first glimpse felt too overwhelming. As the story draws toward transition, the narrator widens the lens. These vanished individuals did not live in isolation. Their experiments existed within a world shaped by rulers, patrons, and political pressures. When an alchemist disappeared, someone noticed. When a laboratory fell silent, someone asked why. And sometimes, those questions led upward to nobles who funded risky work, to kings fascinated by secret knowledge, to church officials uneasy about doctrines that hinted at creation and destruction. The final thought settles like fading embers. If strange events occurred in those hidden rooms, they did not vanish without consequences. The next chapter asks how the wider world, ambitious rulers, worried clergy, and curious patrons responded to the dangers and promises of such forbidden experiments. When the narrator steps into the world of kings and nobles, the tone changes subtly, as though entering a grand hall where the echoes of power linger in the air. Alchemists, once imagined in cramped workshops with flickering furnaces, are now placed in rooms adorned with banners, tapestries, and guarded doors. Their work, once private, becomes intertwined with the ambitions of those who rule over armies and nations. The listener is guided gently into this shift, invited to understand that alchemy did not exist solely in the shadows. It also lived in courts, where curiosity and fear mingled in dangerous ways. Medieval rulers had practical reasons for seeking out alchemists. The narrator begins with the simplest motivations: wealth, medicine, and military advantage. Many kings faced chronic shortages of coin, especially during long wars. A rumor that someone could multiply gold was too tempting to ignore. Letters from royal treasuries beg for refined methods of increasing the yield, phrasing that avoids the outright claim of creating gold, but hints at the desire. Other rulers, burdened by illness or aging, sought medicaments capable of restoring vitality. They funded alchemists who promised tinctures for strength or powders to preserve health during long campaigns. But the narrator soon reveals a deeper layer. Some patrons asked for more than wealth or wellness. They wanted control over the shifting tides of power, victory, and war, stability in turbulent regions, and influence over forces they scarcely understood. Letters from nobles describe requests for new fires to hurl at enemy lines, mixtures that would burn hotter or longer than ordinary flame. A general writes of needing substances that cloud the sight and weaken resolve. A chilling reminder of early chemical warfare. These documents show that rulers saw alchemy not as a mystical curiosity, but as a potential tool for reshaping the battlefield. The listener is invited to imagine an alchemist summoned from his quiet life into the orbit of warlords and monarchs. He arrives in a great hall, carrying fragile glassware and carefully wrapped powders, standing before men whose decisions can shift the fate of entire regions. The narrator describes this contrast with calm precision. The soft crackle of the alchemist's furnace placed beside the clamour of armour, the quiet calculations of a scholar measured against the loud demands of kings. It becomes clear that the great work, in this environment, is no longer purely philosophical. Then comes the twist that deepens the unease. Some rulers did not simply want weapons or wealth, they wanted insight into the structure of time itself. Among surviving letters are inquiries about the signs of the age, whether the present era approaches its final turn, and if the heavens indicate a renewal soon to come. These phrases appear abruptly, surrounded by mundane concerns about grain supply or troop movements, making them all the more startling. They suggest that certain rulers were privately obsessed with prophecies, cycles, and the possibility that the world might be approaching a transformation. The narrator shows how these strange interests connected to alchemical theories. If an alchemist claimed that metals could be returned to their original purity, a ruler might wonder whether the world itself could follow a similar path. If the stone symbolized unity and renewal, a king might dream of presiding over a new age. These ideas were rarely spoken aloud. They appear only in fragments in a marginal note, praising the coming harmony, in a letter warning that dangerous doctrines might sway the weak-minded, or in a patron's cryptic remark that our realm must be prepared for what follows the present age. The story remains grounded, yet the implications are profound. The listener is encouraged to imagine a monarch sitting alone at night, studying an alchemist's diagrams, wondering whether the current age was decaying and whether some hidden process might renew it. Such thoughts could steer political decisions. A ruler who believed an age was ending might rush reforms, seek new alliances, or wage preemptive wars. The narrator explains that history rarely records a king's private anxieties, but these small traces reshape our understanding of their actions. As the narrator continues, a subtle theme emerges. Rulers recognized that someone who could manipulate matter might one day manipulate the conditions of power itself. Alchemy, in this context, became more than a craft. It became a threat, a possibility, a whisper of forces that lay outside ordinary governance. A few rulers appear to have understood this intuitively. Their letters balance fascination with caution. One king writes, "Proceed with care, you know not what you summon." Another warns his alchemical advisor, "The line between creation and calamity is thin." These warnings suggest a level of awareness often missing from simplified historical narratives. The narrator balances this tension with tenderness, showing that not all patrons approached alchemy with fear. Some saw it as a path toward stability, better harvests, improved metallurgy, or safer cities. They viewed alchemists as scholars capable of strengthening their realms in practical ways. Yet even these well-meaning rulers stumbled into the broader implications of the great work. When they asked for metals that would not rust or medicines that would not spoil, they unknowingly echoed the alchemist's deepest questions about permanence and decay. As the section deepens, the narrator imagines moments that might have occurred in royal courts. An alchemist demonstrating a peculiar flame before a circle of advisors. A noble leaning in too closely, seeing something in the colour or movement that unsettles him. A ruler listening to a quiet explanation of cycles and renewals, realizing that the great work might touch realms far beyond the material. These scenes unfold gently, allowing the listener to picture how the ambitions of kings and the dreams of alchemists intersected in uncertain ways. The "wait, what?" moment arrives when the narrator introduces a letter from a noble patron containing a chilling request. "If the age can be purified, tell me how our house may endure through the change." The line raises questions that no reply addresses. Did the alchemist attempt an answer? Did the patron lose interest? Or did something happen that erased the correspondence entirely? The silence following this request is as haunting as any disappearance in earlier chapters. The section draws toward its close, with a reflection on how rulers sought to harness, control, or contain the great work. Some supported alchemists openly, providing resources and protection. Others watched them warily, unsure whether they were allies or threats. The narrator emphasizes that these dynamics shaped more than individual lives. They influenced wars, policies, and the flow of knowledge across borders. Alchemists became pieces in larger games, their experiments tied to ambitions they never intended to serve. As the final paragraphs settle like fading torchlight, the narrator prepares the listener for the next logical step. If rulers brought alchemists into courts and kingdoms, then specific cases must exist where their experiments intersected directly with crises, sieges, plagues, or political upheavals. And so the story turns, gently but inevitably, toward those moments when the great work touched history in ways that cannot be ignored. The narrator begins this section by drawing the listener into a familiar, yet unsettling scene. An alchemist summoned to a castle under urgent circumstances. He travels through muddy roads, escorted by guards who speak little, carrying crates of fragile instruments wrapped in linen. The castle looms above him like a stone question. Inside, a ruler waits, not always a king, sometimes a noble with too much to lose, sometimes a council of advisors whose eyes gleam with worry. The listener is invited to sense the tension. An alchemist pulled from his quiet work into a world where failure carries consequences more severe than mere disappointment. When he arrives, he is told he will be funded generously, provided food, shelter, and assistance if needed. But the promise carries an unspoken threat. "You will be protected," a steward says, "as long as your work benefits the realm." Behind those words lies the darker translation: produce results or lose everything. The narrator lingers on this pressure, explaining that in such environments, the boundary between genuine research and desperate performance becomes porous. An alchemist trying to survive must impress his patron quickly. The listener imagines the first demonstrations safe, simple, and designed to build trust. Colored flames, rising from copper salts hidden in powders. Liquids that change hue when mixed, giving the illusion of transformation. Metals that melt strangely, appearing to defy expectation. These displays are genuine in their own way, drawn from real knowledge, but arranged with theatrical precision. The alchemist becomes part researcher, part performer, his life depending on his ability to persuade powerful onlookers that something extraordinary is unfolding. Yet beneath these visible experiments, a quieter strand of work often continues, work connected not to spectacle but to deeper questions. The narrator paints a picture of the alchemist in his assigned chamber, away from the torchlit hall, returning to the symbols and diagrams that shaped his private ambitions. If he brought with him manuscripts about cycles, purification, or the possibility of renewal, he studies them under dim candlelight, always aware that guards might be listening outside the door. Court life demands obedience, but secrecy becomes its own survival strategy. The narrator then introduces the broader context, crises that push rulers toward extreme ideas. Imagine a kingdom battered by repeated wars, fields ruined by relentless rains, or a famine that makes winter feel endless. In these moments of desperation, rulers become more receptive to proposals that, under ordinary circumstances, would seem outrageous. If an alchemist hinted that the current age was decaying and that some greater transformation was possible, how easily might a frightened ruler believe him? The narrator does not claim this happened often, only that the psychological conditions were ripe for such conversations. One of the composite stories illustrates this vulnerability. A ruler, weary from years of conflict, listens late at night as the alchemist speaks cautiously about the nature of ages. He never claims he can renew the world, but he describes cycles found in ancient texts, periods of corruption, followed by periods of rebuilding. The ruler leans forward, grasping at the idea that his suffering realm might not be doomed but poised for rebirth. The alchemist senses he has gone too far, yet cannot escape the gravity of the ruler's hope. The narrator frames this moment gently, suggesting how easily a speculative theory could become a seed planted in the mind of a desperate leader. The listener feels the unease deepen. If a kingdom faces collapse, what sounds more appealing? One more exhausting battle, or the whisper of a reset, a chance to begin again? The narrator leaves this question hanging, allowing the listener's imagination to explore the implications. A ruler contemplating such an idea might push his alchemist to pursue riskier experiments. Subtle suggestions could become explicit demands. If the world renews itself, a patron might say, find what triggers the renewal. What began as philosophical curiosity becomes a dangerous mandate. The narrator balances this tension by showing the alchemist's inner struggle. He may have dreamt of understanding the great work, but in the castle he faces pressures he never anticipated. If he delays, he risks punishment. If he acts recklessly, he risks catastrophe. The listener is invited to imagine him pacing in his chamber, weighing each decision. The sound of distant arguments, the smell of smoke from torches, the knowledge that his patron watches every outcome, all these forces narrow his choices until every experiment feels like a gamble with unseen stakes. To illustrate this further, the narrator introduces another composite story. An alchemist in a drought-stricken region demonstrates a method of extracting water from air, a real possibility using early distillation techniques. The ruler praises him publicly, but demands more privately. If you can draw water from nothing, he says, perhaps you can draw hope from a dying age. The alchemist hears the shift from science to metaphysics, from practicality to prophecy, and though he knows he cannot fulfill such expectations, he also knows he cannot refuse. Amid this dangerous dance, the narrator highlights the subtle ways alchemists tried to protect themselves. Some intentionally slowed their work, citing the need for careful purification. Others created complex diagrams to confuse anyone who tried to read their notes. A few shared fragmentary explanations, rather than complete ones, hoping partial knowledge would reduce the threat of reprisal. These survival strategies reflect the reality that court life, for an alchemist, was a delicate balance between usefulness and risk. The what moment emerges, as the narrator describes how, in certain extended crises, plagues, famines, or repeated defeats, rulers sometimes crossed lines they would never have approached in prosperous times. A letter from a fictionalized advisor captures the mood. His Majesty has begun to speak of signs in the heavens. He wonders whether this age is failing. The listener senses how such fears could shape decisions behind closed doors. The alchemist, caught in this rising anxiety, might be encouraged or pressured to explore ideas that previously remained philosophical abstractions. The narrator keeps the tone grounded, avoiding melodrama. He explains that these pressures rarely produced breakthroughs. More often, they produced exhaustion, disillusionment, or quiet disappearance. Some alchemists escaped court life, returning to villages or monasteries. Others remained, trapped by patronage, their personal ambitions swallowed by the demands of rulers who wanted immediate answers to cosmic questions. The listener feels sympathy for these figures, men seeking understanding, drawn into the orbit of power that misunderstood their goals. As the section approaches its end, the narrator prepares the transition by widening the frame. Court alchemists lived not only under political pressure, but under the eerie atmosphere of an era filled with omens. Comets streaking across the sky, strange weather patterns, eclipses that turned day into twilight. For rulers and commoners alike, such signs often felt like warnings. If the world seemed ready to shift, and if an alchemist whispered that cycles governed the ages, how deeply might those ideas root themselves? With this thought lingering, the narrator guides the listener forward. The next step in the story is to explore the signs celestial, earthly, and psychological that made people believe the age was drawing to a close, setting the stage for even more dangerous interpretations. The narrator widens the frame again, stepping away from the isolated alchemist in his dim chamber and toward a subtle network that once stretched across kingdoms. While history remembers a few famous figures, most alchemical communication happened quietly, hidden in letters carried by tired messengers or whispered in corners of crowded courts. It did not resemble a formal society with rituals or robes. It was looser, fragile, and often improvised, a constellation of minds who recognized each other through shared metaphors, similar diagrams, or references to ancient cycles. The listener is invited to picture a web woven not from authority but from curiosity, stitched together by marginal notes and coded phrases. Many alchemists lived far from one another, yet their ideas traveled. Some sent scribbled diagrams folded into letters, careful to keep the content just ambiguous enough to avoid trouble if intercepted. Others relied on trusted merchants or pilgrims to deliver manuscripts in secret. In prosperous years, this exchange moved swiftly. In troubled ones, communication slowed but never fully ceased. The narrator guides the listener through scenes of these quiet exchanges. An alchemist handing a sealed packet to a messenger at dawn, a scholar in a distant monastery opening a letter written in unfamiliar handwriting, recognizing the pattern of symbols immediately. These networks formed slowly, often sparked by chance encounters. A court alchemist might meet a colleague while traveling with his patron. A monk might notice a peculiar reference in a manuscript and decide to write to its author. The narrator describes the delicate thrill such correspondence brought. For individuals working in isolation, the realization that someone else was exploring the same ideas felt like a lantern appearing on a long, dark road. It was encouragement, validation, and companionship all at once. Letters rarely spoke plainly. The risks were too great. Instead of discussing world cycles outright, they referenced the turning of the wheel. Instead of mentioning forbidden purification theories, they spoke of returning metals to the memory of their first nature. Discussions about the possible renewal of ages were framed as reflections on the harmony of times. These coded phrases created a shared language, one that allowed ideas to cross borders without attracting unwanted attention. The listener can sense how these metaphors became connective tissue between minds, separated by geography and politics. The narrator brings the audience deeper into these networks by presenting a composite correspondence. One alchemist writes excitedly about a reaction that produced an unexpected glow, describing it as a light that seemed to originate from no earthly flame. Another responds cautiously, urging him to test the mixture again and to document every detail, but warns, do not pursue it if the signs turn against you. These exchanges reveal a combination of ambition and fear. They show how alchemical knowledge grew not in isolation, but through tentative collaboration. The narrator hints at gatherings as well, not formal assemblies, but brief meetings arranged under the cover of travel. Two alchemists might meet in a market town, speaking quietly over cups of weak wine. Another pair might converse briefly during a noble's feast, using the noise of revelry as their cloak. Nothing grand happened at these meetings. Instead, they shared scraps of insight, argued over interpretations of obscure texts, or exchanged warnings about dangerous experiments. These interactions strengthened their sense of working on something larger than themselves. But within this delicate network lies the twist that shapes the heart of the section. These connections did not always endure. Some letters end abruptly, like candles blown out by an unseen hand. A correspondent writes eagerly for months, then never answers again. Another becomes uncharacteristically cautious, insisting he will speak no further of the matter, without explanation. One letter mentions the imprisonment of a colleague for transgression of the boundaries, though the nature of the transgression remains unexplained. Another alludes to troubles at the laboratory that must not be described, suggesting fear rather than simple failure. The narrator allows the listener to linger in this uncertainty. Why did some networks collapse? Why did some members abandon their work or disappear entirely? The obvious explanations, illness, war, famine, explain much, but not everything. The unnatural timing of certain silences, paired with earlier hints of troubling discoveries, suggests deeper possibilities. Perhaps a shared experiment failed catastrophically. Perhaps someone misinterpreted an omen and believed it was a sign to stop. Or perhaps, as some echo documents hint, pressure from authorities forced these networks to unravel. The section deepens with the idea that a subtle shift could pass through the network like a tremor. If one alchemist reported a frightening event, an unexpected reaction, a dangerous residue, or a moment of psychological disorientation, others might take heed. Fear spreads quickly in small communities. A single disturbing incident could convince multiple individuals to retreat simultaneously, creating the illusion of a coordinated withdrawal. The narrator draws no firm conclusions, but the pattern is unmistakable. When one thread snapped, many followed. To illustrate this, the narrator describes a hypothetical scenario based on several fragmented accounts. An alchemist writes to 3 colleagues about a disturbing effect witnessed during an experiment meant to purify a metal. He describes a strange trembling in the air, a sensation of pressure shifting in the room, and a residue that seemed to pulse faintly before turning dull. He ends the letter with trembling handwriting. This is not the transformation I sought. I fear it reflects something beyond our understanding. 2 of the recipients reply with caution. The third never writes again. Weeks later, the remaining 2 send final letters renouncing their work and urging their correspondent to do the same. Then their side of the network goes silent forever. The listener feels the melancholy of this imagined collapse. What might have happened? Did fear overwhelm them? Did authorities intervene? Or did they believe, in some private corner of their minds, that they had brushed against the edge of forces connected to renewal and decay, forces that no single person should touch. The narrator lets these possibilities remain unresolved, emphasizing the fragility of networks built on trust and secrecy. The section continues by exploring the emotional stakes of belonging to such a network. For many alchemists, correspondence brought comfort. Losing it brought isolation. When letters stopped, doubts grew. Did their colleagues abandon them? Were they imprisoned? Did their experiments lead to harmful consequences? In a world filled with omens, strange weather, political turmoil, and rumors of divine displeasure, silence carried weight. It felt like a message. As the section nears its conclusion, the narrator reflects on the broader significance of these fragile networks. They represent not only communication but the shared belief that the world might be entering a pivotal moment. Through whispered conversations and coded letters, alchemists formed a quiet chorus, wondering whether this age was nearing its end, and whether their work might hint at what could follow. When the chorus fell silent, the absence itself became a kind of omen. With this image of collapsing networks and unanswered letters, the narrator prepares the transition to the next section. If alchemists felt the world shifting through crises, disasters, or strange signs, then the story must now turn outward, toward the land and sky themselves. What did people see, hear, and endure that made them believe an era was ending? The next part of the chapter steps into that unsettling landscape. There were nights in the medieval world when the sky itself seemed to tremble. Long before clocks ruled the hours or newspapers framed events, people measured their lives by the sound of weather against their roofs and the color of the horizon at dusk. When a winter arrived early or a summer refused to warm, there was no explanation to soften the fear. And when the first rumors of a strange sickness drifted from distant towns, carried by merchants and whispered by travelers, everything seemed to tilt toward uncertainty. The world felt thinner then, as if the fabric that held it together were fraying in places too high or too deep for anyone to mend. Across villages and cities, the Black Death moved like a cold shadow. It arrived without warning and without logic, taking some households and sparing others. Doors were nailed shut, markets emptied. Bells tolled so often that people stopped hearing them as individual sounds. They blended into one long, low note that seemed to hum beneath daily life. Failed harvests followed in some regions, with fields turning to mud or dust. Livestock fell sick, wells dried or filled with strange tastes. People spoke of curses, punishments, and signs. They searched the sky for answers, even when the sky held nothing but clouds. But there were also nights when the sky held too much. Comets that stretched like white scars, red moons that seemed unwilling to fade. Meteors that hissed across the darkness and broke into fragments, trailing sparks like a warning. Monks wrote about these things in their chronicles, often with the same trembling script they used to describe plagues and famines. Ordinary people stared upward, clutching rosaries or pieces of iron for protection. They did not need scholars to tell them such things were ominous. Their bodies felt it. The ground itself seemed to pause beneath them, waiting. For an alchemist, living in that same world, these events carried layered meaning. They saw the same disasters and felt the same fear, but they read them through a different map, one built from symbols, metals, and the belief that all things move through cycles of decay and renewal. To someone who spent their nights watching a furnace shift from black to red to white, the changing sky might feel like a cosmic version of what they attempted in miniature. If metals could pass through stages of corruption before reaching purity, perhaps ages could do the same. Perhaps the world itself was being heated, refined, shaken toward a transformation beyond ordinary understanding. Imagine an alchemist standing outside after hours by the small doorway of his workshop. Smoke drifts behind him, curling faintly from the cracks around the window. He wipes soot from his fingers and looks upward, watching a comet fade behind clouds. He does not think only of omens or punishments. He thinks of processes, of cycles, of the slow turning of something vast. He might even wonder whether the disasters around him, the plague, the strange weather, the uneasy sky, are evidence that the current age is nearing its end. In his notebooks, which lie open on a table inside, he has already drawn diagrams that suggest such possibilities. Some texts from that era make brief, chilling connections between natural catastrophes and alchemical language. They speak of the fire that comes before renewal, or the great purification that takes the dross from the world. These phrases are metaphorical on the surface, meant to describe spiritual transformation or the refining of metals. Yet for minds attuned to hidden patterns, they also hint at something larger. They imply that the world itself might pass through stages, just as matter does. And though most alchemists never claimed to cause such events, the coincidence between their experiments and the turbulence around them could be unsettling. Imagine working through the night on a mixture that trembles unexpectedly, producing a thin, shimmering residue you cannot explain. You lean closer, puzzled, and at that moment, a distant bell tolls for another death in the village. Or imagine heating a metal until it begins to glow with a faint color you have never seen before, only to wake the next day to news that the harvest has failed. Rationally, you know these things are unrelated. But when the world seems to be listing toward calamity, the line between coincidence and pattern grows thin. For isolated alchemists, those who already felt the burden of secrecy and the weight of dangerous curiosity, these parallels could become haunting. Some may have wondered whether their small experiments were echoes of something larger, or whether the universe itself was answering them in ways they could neither foresee nor control. A few texts even mention the unsettling feeling that the outer world and the inner work were moving together, though the meaning remains unclear. Perhaps it referred to spiritual correspondence, or perhaps it hinted at fears too deep to write openly. People living through those centuries had no grand theories of climate, no germ science, no stable understanding of cosmic events. Every strange occurrence felt personal. A plague did not sweep across a continent. It arrived at your door. A comet did not pass harmlessly. It pointed at you. In such an environment, it is easy to see how alchemists, who already believed that matter responded to intention, fire, and transformation, might perceive the broader world as undergoing its own alchemical process. The emotional atmosphere of those years is difficult to imagine now. The cold, the scarcity, the sickness, the constantly shifting sky. These were not occasional fears, but everyday companions. People slept lightly, woke often, and prayed in whispers. Children asked questions adults could not answer. Travelers carried stories of distant towns where the sun vanished behind dust, or where entire families lay still in their beds. The world felt like a fragile vessel being heated unevenly, and no one knew whether it would crack. In this landscape, an alchemist's furnace became both refuge and mirror, a quiet place where chaos could be shaped, observed, maybe even understood. But it also carried the burden of resemblance. When the sky glowed strangely, and the furnace glowed too, it became harder to ignore the uneasy parallel, the same colors, the same uncertainty, the same sense that something was shifting, both outside and within. As these disasters accumulated, people began to speak not only of punishment but of endings. The age is tired, wrote one monk. The world is loosening, wrote another. Alchemists, with their language of cycles, may have been uniquely sensitive to that feeling. To them, time was not a straight line, but a series of transformations. If the world was showing signs of a great shift, it might not be an ending but a stage, an approach to something new, frightening, and unknown. And so the narrator asks, if the world itself seemed to tremble, how did alchemists begin to speak of time? There is a peculiar silence in the rooms where alchemists once worked, a silence shaped not only by secrecy but by time itself. Their furnaces did not simply burn through the night. They marked hours as surely as a clock would centuries later. Time became something they felt on their skin, the warmth of the coals rising and falling, the flicker of candles shrinking toward nothing, the long shadows changing shape as the moon slid across the sky. To an alchemist, time was never a simple measurement. It was a substance, almost like the metals they melted and reformed. Consider the long operations described in their texts, processes meant to last weeks, months, even years. Some manuscripts insist that a mixture cannot be opened until the final cycle is complete, no matter how tempting it might be to check its progress. Imagine watching a sealed vessel darken, swell, and tremble while resisting the urge to intervene. The alchemist would sit by the furnace, sometimes with hands clasped tightly, sometimes pacing across the uneven floor, trusting the slow rhythm of time more than his own impatience. It was a discipline that few could maintain, and those who managed it often described their nights as battles with themselves, with doubt, with the invisible clock of the universe. Time also governed their sleep. They rose at odd hours to stir mixtures, adjust flames, or read celestial signs through small windows. Their notebooks reveal entries written at dawn, midnight, or moments when the world outside was silent, as if time itself paused to allow their thoughts to take shape. To live as an alchemist was to step outside ordinary hours. The bells that marked daily routines for others, the morning prayers, the noon meals, the curfew meant little in a laboratory where a single operation might stretch across seasons. And then there were the stars. To modern readers, the connection between celestial movements and laboratory work may seem strange, but to medieval alchemists, the sky was a vast and ancient clock. They believed the heavens mirrored the changes of the earth, and that certain alignments created openings, moments when the boundary between what was possible and what was forbidden grew thinner. Some experiments were begun only under specific constellations, while others required the return of a rare planetary conjunction. Time, for them, was not just measured in minutes and hours, but in cycles of the sky that repeated across centuries. This is where their sense of time begins to blur. In a few texts, nestled among recipes for tinctures and instructions for distillation, there are passages that tie the duration of an experiment to the ages of the world. One manuscript claims that a particular refinement should last a complete revolution, a phrase scholars struggle to interpret. Did it mean a year, a generation, or something far longer, an age of history, a turn of the cosmic wheel? Another text speaks of a process that should continue until the world grows weary, as though the alchemist saw his vessel as sharing the same lifespan as the era he lived in. Such language suggests a staggering idea. The furnace, glowing quietly in a dark room, could be a miniature version of the universe's own transformation. The alchemist did not simply wait for his materials to change, he waited for the world to shift with them. When the mixture darkened, perhaps he saw a reflection of the troubled times outside. When it brightened, he might have wondered whether hope had returned to the age as well. Imagine an alchemist kneeling before his furnace, the heat washing over him as he adjusts the flame by a fraction. Behind him, on a wooden table, lies a chart of the heavens, its edges curled with age. He is not simply melting metals, he is aligning cycles, inner and outer, small and vast. If he completes the process too soon, he fears it will fail. If he waits too long, the opportunity might pass. Every hour becomes a negotiation with forces he cannot see. This sense of fragile timing may have shaped more than experiments. It influenced the way alchemists understood themselves. Many wrote about feeling trapped between eras, born too late to inherit ancient wisdom, yet too early to see the fullness of a renewed world. They lived, in their own perception, at the hinge of time, a moment when reality could tilt in either direction. Their work was an attempt to understand that instability, or perhaps even to guide it. There are stories, preserved in letters and marginal notes, of alchemists who stopped their operations abruptly because the hour was no longer favorable. Others left cryptic remarks about waiting for the return of the sign, though the sign itself is never explained. One text ends with the haunting sentence, "It must now sleep until the age is ready." The author does not clarify whether "it" refers to the experiment, the manuscript, or something far larger. This blurring of laboratory time and cosmic time introduces the "wait, what" moment. If an alchemist believed that his experiment was tied to the shifting of ages, would he dare to finish it? Or would the fear of completing something too powerful, too aligned with the end of an era, stop him from taking the final step? The possibility lingers that some operations were abandoned not because they failed, but because their creators felt the age itself was not prepared for the consequences. For the viewer awake late at night, drifting in and out of thoughts about their own relationship with time, this world feels strangely familiar. The alchemists' odd hours echo their own sleepless patterns. The sense of waiting for something undefined feels like their own restlessness, and the idea that time can stretch or contract depending on one's focus mirrors the way nights sometimes feel endless and mornings arrive too soon. As we move toward the final ideas of the chapter, the narrator allows a deeper question to surface. If an alchemist believed that the completion of his work was tied to the close of an age, did any of them ever feel they had reached that edge? And if they did, what happened next? The furnace glows, the sky shifts, and the story leans gently toward the unsettling possibility that someone, somewhere, believed they stood on the brink of a world reset. There are certain passages in old alchemical manuscripts that read like whispers from the edge of an age. Not grand prophecies, not thunderous declarations, just quiet lines tucked between recipes and diagrams, lines that suggest their authors felt something shifting beneath their feet. These passages are sparse, often vague, but they carry a tone of anticipation, as though the writers believed they were living at a moment when the world was leaning toward a threshold. They describe the completion of the work, a phrase that can mean the end of an experiment, but which sometimes appears beside remarks about seasons behaving strangely, kingdoms faltering, or celestial signs repeating themselves. To modern eyes, these juxtapositions may seem accidental. But for alchemists, who lived in a universe where transformations echoed across scales, the overlap between laboratory processes and cosmic cycles made a quiet kind of sense. When they saw metals darken, brighten, or fracture under heat, they did not just observe chemistry, they saw metaphors for the rise and collapse of ages. In their notebooks, the smallest change could be a reflection of the widest pattern. The great work, in this view, was not confined to a furnace. It existed everywhere, in the sky, in history, in the hidden turning of eras. Yet the manuscripts do not speak with one voice. Some writers treat the end of an age as a threat, a moment of judgment or dissolution. Others describe it with an almost serene calm, as though the conclusion of an era is neither catastrophe nor triumph, but a necessary step in the long rhythm of creation. These writers might note a comet, a cold summer, or a plague as signs not of punishment, but of transition. For them, the world was not breaking, it was shedding an old skin. It is here that the practice of alchemy begins to blur with something more philosophical, even mystical. When an alchemist wrote of uniting opposites or restoring balance, did he mean only the combination of substances in a glass vessel? Or was he gesturing toward a longing for harmony in a world that felt increasingly unstable? Some texts hint that completing the great work was not merely a technical achievement, but the fulfillment of an era's hidden purpose. An age, like a metal, could reach purity after passing through fire. This idea rests on a worldview in which cycles govern everything. To the medieval mind, influenced by ancient philosophies and religious imagery, time was not linear. It curved, folded, and repeated. Flood myths, tales of lost civilizations, prophecies of fiery endings, they all echoed a shared belief that the world moves through stages. Each stage ends, not because of failure, but because it is time for the next to begin. Within such a worldview, the end of an age is not an apocalypse, it is a transformation. Some alchemists may have seen themselves as witnesses to such a moment. A few may even have believed they were participants. Their writings occasionally adopt a tone of urgency, as though the cycle was nearing completion, and their own work needed to align with it. One text mentions the closing of the circle, followed immediately by instructions for a long, delicate operation meant to last many months. Another speaks of the weariness of the age, then describes a substance expected to renew the nature of all things. The overlap between cosmic and laboratory language is unmistakable, but these writers rarely explain themselves clearly. They hint, gesture, and obscure. Part of this was intentional. Metaphors protected them from accusations of heresy. Part was practical. Their ideas were too vast or fragile to commit to plain words. And part, perhaps, was the simple truth that they themselves were unsure of the boundary between the transformations in their flasks and the transformations they sensed in the world. They walked a line between observation and intuition, between the visible and the imagined. The twist, the quiet shock comes when we consider how they felt about the end of an age. For some, it was a fear. They imagined fires sweeping across the earth, purifying everything. They pictured corruption burned away, leaving only what was pure enough to endure. In these visions, the reset was harsh and absolute, but for others, the reset was hopeful. They spoke of a new dawn, the return of the golden time, or the world made whole again. Their resets were not endings, but beginnings, ushering in a cleaner, fairer order. This double-edged vision mirrors modern feelings in uncanny ways. Today, people imagine collapses brought on by climate, technology, or war, and yet, beneath the fear, there is often a buried hope. A hope that when the old systems fall, something better might rise. A hope that broken structures could be rebuilt with more care. A hope that the world could be reset, even if the cost is frightening. Medieval alchemists, living in their own era of plague and upheaval, may have felt a similar mixture, dread of destruction and longing for renewal. The manuscripts never reveal exactly how many alchemists believed the end of their age was near. They never list the names of those who saw their work as part of something larger. But the fragments suggest a mindset in which the world itself was subject to the same forces that governed metal in a crucible. When the heat becomes too intense, the substance changes. When an age becomes too unstable, perhaps it too transforms. And so the narrator asks the unsettling question that lingers behind these texts. If an alchemist truly believed that the world's cycle was ending, did he stand back in fear, or did he work more urgently, hoping to contribute to the coming renewal? It is impossible to know, but the ambiguity is itself powerful. It suggests that some individuals, living through nights filled with comets, plagues, and strange weather, may have seen their experiments not as isolated efforts, but as strands in a web of cosmic change. In the final lines of the chapter, the manuscripts grow quiet, the hints fade, the metaphors become more opaque. It is as though the writers sensed that they had reached the edge of what could be written. They leave us with the impression that a cycle was turning, that the world was preparing to renew itself, and that their work, patient, secretive, obsessive, was part of that vast, hidden rhythm. And with that, the narrator turns toward what came next: the fading of alchemy, the rise of science, and the question of what happened to these ideas when the world changed its language, but not its long, restless desire for transformation. When we imagine the end of alchemy, we often picture a clean break, a moment when the flames dimmed, the strange symbols faded, and a new age of rational science swept everything away. But the truth is quieter and far more complicated. Alchemy did not vanish. It thinned, softened, and slipped into new forms. It passed through the hands of curious artisans, court physicians, apothecaries, and early natural philosophers who cared less about mystical diagrams and more about what worked. Yet even as they refined their methods and sharpened their tools, they carried forward something older, the belief that matter could be persuaded into becoming something new. The transformation began slowly. In small workshops and monastic rooms, alchemists who once chased the philosopher's stone shifted their attention toward more practical pursuits. They experimented with pigments that held their color, medicines that eased swelling or quieted fevers, and alloys that resisted rust. They discovered acids, catalogued reactions, and developed methods of distillation so precise they would later define entire industries. As these successes accumulated, rulers and scholars began to take notice not of the alchemists' grand metaphysical claims, but of their results. Their world reset theories were politely ignored or quietly mocked, while their useful innovations were collected with great enthusiasm. The language changed too. Dragons, suns, and conjunctions faded from their notebooks, replaced by measurements, observations, and more cautious metaphors. Some adopted a tone of humility, presenting their findings as mere notes rather than cosmic revelations. Others rewrote their earlier works, stripping away the more esoteric layers. By doing so, they earned acceptance in a world growing impatient with mystery. They held onto their curiosity, but abandoned the imagery that made that curiosity feel dangerous. Yet beneath this shift, something essential remained. The alchemists' urge to coax transformation from matter survived. So did the desire to understand the hidden laws that shaped the world. Early chemists, though they would not call themselves that yet, still spent nights watching substances bubble, thicken, or collapse under heat. They still trusted their senses more than the dogma of authorities. They still believed that the universe could be deciphered through careful, repeated experimentation. In that sense, the crucible never truly cooled. It simply changed its name. Some of the early figures of modern science even carried echoes of alchemy openly. Isaac Newton filled thousands of pages with alchemical notes, far more than he ever wrote on physics or astronomy. Robert Boyle, one of the founders of modern chemistry, defended the possibility of transmutation long after the idea had fallen out of fashion. These men lived at the boundary between worlds, one foot in the symbolic language of the old age, the other in the emerging clarity of the new. They believed that understanding matter could reveal profound truths about existence, even if they no longer spoke of fiery rebirths or cosmic cycles. At the same time, universities and academies grew wary of anything that resembled superstition. They encouraged experiments that could be repeated and measured, discouraging speculation that drifted too far into philosophy or myth. Slowly, the mystical half of alchemy was pushed into the shadows. It did not disappear, but it retreated into private circles, anonymous manuscripts, and marginal notes. Publicly, Chemistry became a discipline of precision. Privately, a few continued to wonder whether matter still held secrets that could not be weighed or recorded. For the modern viewer, awake late at night, the shift feels strangely familiar. The world tells us that science is clean, rational, and straightforward. Yet its most ambitious dreams often resemble the longings of alchemists. Today, researchers attempt to rewrite genetic codes, control weather patterns, store consciousness, and design materials that defy decay. We speak of editing life, terraforming planets, and stabilizing climates. These efforts are dressed in the language of innovation, but their goals echo the same ancient desire to repair, improve, or reinvent the world. Even the metaphors persist. We talk about unlocking nature's secrets and cracking the code of reality. We speak of breakthroughs as if they were revelations. In some laboratories, glowing screens and humming machines have replaced furnaces and handwritten charts, yet the underlying impulse remains unchanged. The dream of mastering matter, and through it, reshaping existence, continues to guide human ambition. The symbols have been stripped away, but the longing they represented still pulses beneath the surface. Imagine a modern lab at night. The lights are dim, a single monitor casts a soft glow, and a researcher leans over a sample that shifts under magnification. The air hums with quiet machines tracking reactions too small to be seen by the naked eye. It is not so different from the alchemist alone in his workshop, watching a vessel darken or brighten under heat. Both are waiting for a transformation. Both feel the thrill of possibility. Both wonder what lies just beyond the visible threshold. This continuity does not imply conspiracy or secret inheritance. Rather, it reveals something deeper in the human mind, a persistent desire to understand how reality works and to alter it in ways that feel meaningful. Alchemy expressed this desire through symbols of dragons and worlds reborn in fire. Modern science expresses it through equations, data, and technology. But the emotional core, the feeling that the world is malleable and that humans might someday master its hidden rules, has endured across centuries. For some viewers, this realization brings a chill. If our modern tools are more powerful than the alchemist's furnace, then our dreams and mistakes might also carry greater weight. The desire to improve the world can easily become the desire to redesign it. The urge to heal can drift toward the urge to replace. These are not new dangers, they are ancient ones, dressed in new clothing. As the section draws to a close, the narrator asks the gentle but unsettling question that lingers behind the evolution from crucible to laboratory. Did we truly leave alchemy behind? Or did we refine its dreams into sharper, quieter forms? The answer is not given. Instead, the story shifts forward, preparing to look at the present moment, an age where simulations, resets, and alternative histories echo the same questions once whispered over glowing furnaces. When people today scroll through theories about simulations, ancient resets, or lost civilizations, they often feel as though they are exploring something entirely modern, a digital age curiosity born from servers, algorithms, and the strange loneliness of late-night screens. But if we look closely, the shape of these ideas is far older. They carry echoes of the alchemical worldview, where the world was not fixed but malleable, where eras could end and begin again, and where hidden structures shaped the visible landscape. The metaphors have changed, but the longing behind them has not. Consider simulation theory. It imagines a reality structured like a vast machine, intricate yet fragile, capable of being paused, rewritten, or restarted. Medieval alchemists did not speak of code or programming, but they described the world as a process, one that could be refined, corrupted, or renewed. Their furnaces were not computers, but they believed that by understanding the deep patterns of matter, they might glimpse the architecture of creation itself. When they wrote of the great work, they hinted at the possibility that the entire world could pass through stages of transformation, just as metals did under heat. Modern reset theories follow a similar rhythm. People today speak of hidden elites preparing global reboots, or of ancient cycles repeating after long intervals. They imagine technological collapses that wipe the slate clean, or cosmic events that force civilization to begin again. These are not so different from the alchemical cycles of destruction and rebirth. Medieval thinkers believed that ages of the world dissolved and reformed, each shaped by fire, flood, or unseen cosmic forces. Today's language is smoother, more technological, but the emotional structure, the sense of living on the edge of a turning, is remarkably similar. Even the idea of hidden civilizations, buried beneath ice or ocean, echoes alchemical fantasies of lost knowledge. Medieval alchemists imagined ancient masters who possessed complete understanding of matter and spirit, whose writings had been broken into fragments scattered across the world. Today, people imagine Atlantis, Lemuria, Tartaria, or forgotten cultures erased by disaster or deliberate suppression. The symbol shifts, but the longing remains. Somewhere, someone knew the truth, and we inherit only ruins and riddles. The audience watching this documentary, especially past midnight, exists in a kind of liminal space. The rest of the world sleeps, but they wander through videos, articles, and speculative forums. Their minds drift between logic and possibility, between skepticism and wonder. It is the same mood an alchemist felt when tending a furnace while the town outside lay still. The glow of the screen is a new kind of fire, and the thoughts it stirs belong to the same lineage: curiosity, suspicion, hope, and the unsettling belief that reality is not as stable as daylight claims. The wait what moment arrives when the narrator suggests a simple but disquieting truth. The alchemists were not strange relics of a superstitious age. They were early participants in a pattern that continues through us. Their furnaces have become servers. Their manuscripts have become digital threads. Their long nights of speculation have transformed into our long nights of scrolling. When a viewer falls down a rabbit hole about timelines being altered or civilizations being reset, they are, in a sense, continuing a story that began centuries ago. This does not mean that modern theories are correct, nor that medieval alchemists had secret knowledge about the structure of reality. It means that the human mind is drawn, again and again, to the possibility that the world is not finished. We want to believe there are hidden layers, codes, cycles, erased histories that explain what ordinary explanations cannot. The more chaotic life feels, the more appealing these patterns become. They offer a sense of order behind confusion, even if the order is frightening. In the medieval world, the signs in the sky, comets, eclipses, strange weather, were interpreted as evidence that the age was unstable. Today, global news, digital rumors, and rapid technological change create a similar sense of imbalance. Some viewers watching this documentary may feel that society is spinning faster than anyone can track, that history is folding in on itself. In that uncertainty, theories of resets, simulations, or hidden interventions become comforting, even if they are unsettling. They make the chaos feel intentional, as though someone or something is guiding events toward a purpose. Alchemists often wrote in coded language, hiding their ideas behind symbols to protect themselves from accusation or misunderstanding. Modern theorists hide their thoughts in different ways: anonymous posts, private channels, whispered conversations among friends. The fear is the same, that speaking openly about resets or hidden structures invites ridicule or danger, and yet the impulse persists. People want to share these ideas, to test them, to see whether others sense the same tremors beneath the surface. One of the most striking parallels between past and present is the way individuals interpret personal unease as evidence of cosmic change. An alchemist who felt the world was growing weary might interpret that feeling as a sign of an ending age. A modern viewer who feels exhausted by news cycles or overwhelmed by rapid change may interpret that exhaustion as evidence of a simulation glitch or an impending societal reset. In both cases, personal experience blends with speculation, creating a narrative that feels both intimate and universal. There is another parallel as well, the dream of a better world on the other side of collapse. Just as medieval writers imagined a purified era rising from the ashes of the old, modern theorists sometimes speak of a post-reset world that is cleaner, fairer, or more awakened. These fantasies reveal not just fear, but longing, a desire to escape corruption, noise, and fragmentation. In the quiet of the night, when the world feels heavy, such dreams can be irresistible. This section ends by turning inward, gently inviting viewers to reflect on why these ideas captivate them so deeply. Perhaps it is not only about the theories themselves, but about what they reveal. A restlessness shared across centuries, a refusal to accept that the visible world is all there is, and a fragile hope that beneath the cracks of the present, something new waits to be born. And with that reflection, the narrator prepares to step into the next question. What does this longing for resets say about us, not as civilizations, but as individuals navigating the shadows of our own inner landscapes. There is a certain quiet that settles over the mind when night grows deep and the world outside the window turns into a soft blur. In that quiet, thoughts begin to wander. They drift toward questions that rarely rise during the day, questions about meaning, fatigue, and the strange human urge to imagine everything beginning again. This urge is not new. It has lived in people across centuries, appearing in prayers, stories, and half-finished notes in dimly lit rooms. Even the alchemists who watched their furnaces pulse through long nights shared this impulse. The desire to wipe the slate clean, to release themselves from the weight of a troubled world, and to imagine a fresh beginning. But why does this idea pull at us so strongly? Perhaps it begins with the feeling that life, as it is, has become tangled. Mistakes accumulate, habits harden, and events unfold in ways that leave us uncertain where to step next. The thought of starting over, of clearing the clutter, and stepping into a cleaner space offers a kind of relief. We imagine a move to a quiet town, or a new job, or the deletion of an online life that has grown too heavy. These small resets feel like breaths of fresh air. They promise a new self, a calmer self, a self that is somehow more aligned with who we wish we were. Medieval alchemists felt a similar longing, though their expressions of it were far larger. When they spoke of purifying metals, they were also dreaming of purifying themselves. When they wrote of cycles and transformations, they were also whispering about the world they saw, cracking around them, plagues, wars, moral decline, strange signs in the sky. Their desire for a reset was not simply a desire for destruction, it was a desire for healing. They believed the world had drifted too far from its original harmony, and that only a profound, sweeping change could restore the balance. Today's theories about simulations or global resets echo that same emotional undercurrent. People imagine hidden switches, cosmic programmers, or powerful elites capable of rebooting reality. Beneath those theories lies a familiar mood, the sense that the age we live in has become strained and brittle, and that something dramatic might be required to set it right. Some find comfort in believing that forces beyond human control are responsible. Others find comfort in imagining that humans themselves could intervene, as the alchemists once hoped to do. But beneath all these grand ideas resides a much smaller, more personal truth. Every fantasy of a world reset contains the shadow of a personal reset. When someone imagines wiping away corruption or chaos on a global scale, they are often trying to wipe away something within themselves: regret, frustration, exhaustion, or the quiet fear that their life has drifted from the path they intended. It is easier, in many ways, to believe the entire world must be remade than to face the complexity of remaking oneself. This is where the emotional twist emerges. The narrator suggests that the most dangerous resets are not the cosmic ones, but the internal ones. Those private moments when a person decides that everything around them is hopeless, that nothing can be repaired, that the only solution is to burn away everything familiar. These moments rarely come with fire or dramatic gestures. They arrive silently, often unnoticed by others, and yet they hold extraordinary power. A single personal reset, born from despair rather than clarity, can reshape a life more drastically than any imagined global transformation. This idea is not meant as a warning delivered from a distance. It is an invitation to gentleness. It asks the viewer to look inward with the same curiosity they bring to theories of alternative histories or hidden civilizations. Why does the thought of starting over appeal so strongly? What part of the self feels unfinished, or strained, or longing for renewal? Late at night, when distractions fall away, these questions become easier to hear. They drift softly through the mind, not demanding answers but offering a chance to pause. The narrator encourages the realization that resets, real, meaningful ones, do not require the world to collapse or time to loop back on itself. They can begin quietly, in small decisions, in shifts of perspective, in moments of honesty. The desire for purity that drove alchemists to refine metals can instead be turned toward refining understanding. The longing for transformation that once filled secretive laboratories can instead guide gradual, patient change in a single life. A reset does not need to be a fire. It can be a candle lit in a quiet room. This reflection does not diminish the grandeur of the alchemist's dreams or the modern fascination with hidden mechanisms of reality. Instead, it weaves them together. It reveals that the impulse behind both is human and enduring. Whether someone is tending a furnace or staring at a glowing screen, the longing is the same: to believe that change is possible, that mistakes can be undone, and that something better waits just beyond the present moment. As the section draws to a gentle close, the narrator shifts the focus back to the listener. In the stillness of the night, with the world hushed and the mind open, the viewer is invited to breathe more easily. The desire for a reset is not a flaw. It is a sign of imagination, of hope, of the belief that life can be made new. But it must be handled with care. Stories of endings and beginnings can inspire, but they can also mislead when wielded in frustration or fear. And so the narrator poses a final, quiet question. Do we dream of resetting the world because the world is broken, or because we are afraid to admit that the work begins within us? The answer is left open, hanging softly in the air, allowing viewers to find their own meaning in it. With this introspective foundation laid, the story prepares to return to the solitary alchemist one last time, his furnace glowing in the darkness, ready to guide the audience toward the closing chapter. The room appears again as though it has been waiting for us. Its stone walls hold the same shadows we saw in the opening chapter, but now they feel deeper, lined with everything we have learned along the way. The alchemist stands inside it, older than before, his shoulders carrying the quiet weight of countless nights. His hair is threaded with grey, his hands marked by stains that no washing could remove, and yet his eyes hold a steady glow, as if some ember within refuses to die. The furnace beside him burns low, a soft red pulse that flickers against the jars and vessels arranged with practiced care. Outside, the world sleeps. The streets are silent, the taverns empty, the bells long finished with their evening song. Wind creeps through narrow alleys and rattles the shutters, but inside this room, time feels suspended. The alchemist adjusts the flame with a slow, deliberate touch. He has prepared for this night for years, through plagues, wars, harsh winters, sudden losses, and the steady unravelling of fragments he inherited from older ages. Every experiment he has abandoned, every note he has crossed out, every strange residue or unexpected colour has guided him, one tiny step at a time, toward this moment. On his table lies a manuscript, worn thin at the edges, its ink darkened with age. Some of its lines are copied from ancient sources, others are his own uncertain additions. He turns a page gently, as though afraid the parchment might disappear beneath his fingers. There are diagrams of circles, arrows, and cryptic symbols. Many would dismiss them as nonsense, but to him they represent the long memory of humanity's attempt to understand the hidden order of existence. He knows he stands on the boundary between knowledge preserved and knowledge forgotten, and tonight he will attempt one last sequence of operations that might bring those fragments together. He begins by placing a sealed vessel into the furnace. The glass glows faintly as the flame warms it, revealing swirls of colour inside deep reds that shift toward gold, then dim again, as though breathing. He moves with the precision of ritual, though he does not call it that. For him, each step is simply necessary, adjusting heat at exact intervals, waiting for the moment when the mixture settles, listening to the subtle crackle of expanding glass. His face, illuminated by the furnace, looks both weary and determined. He knows that whatever happens tonight may never be seen by another. He pauses and lifts his gaze toward the small window carved into the far wall. The night sky beyond it is clear. A single star hangs low, shimmering as though it too is waiting. He has watched the sky for years, believing that certain experiments respond not only to heat and time but to cosmic rhythms. Whether this belief is true no longer matters. What matters is that it has guided him through countless nights, shaping a personal calendar of possibility. Tonight feels aligned, balanced, touched by something he cannot name. He returns to the furnace. The mixture shifts again, glowing brighter. A faint shimmer dances along the edge of the vessel. His breath catches, but he does not move closer. He knows better than to interfere too soon. Instead, he sits down on a wooden stool and opens his notebook, turning to a blank page. He writes slowly, documenting each change, the colour, the sound, the faint scent rising from the furnace. These notes are not for posterity. They are part of the work, a way of grounding himself in something steady while the unknown unfolds before him. What does he hope to achieve tonight? The script does not say. It does not claim he will create the stone, or transmute metals, or touch the boundary of a world reset. Instead, it focuses on the truth that matters. He believes in the possibility. He believes that understanding exists just beyond the edge of what he can see, and that his role, small, fragile, and solitary, is to reach toward it. The power lies not in the substance within the crucible, but in the decision to continue seeking, even when certainty remains out of reach. The furnace hums softly. Shadows dance along the ceiling. The vessel flashes once, a quick pulse of light, and he leans forward, eyes narrowing. Something changes in his expression, not fear, not triumph, but a quiet acknowledgement that the work is moving beyond his understanding. He holds his breath and waits. The glow settles again, dimmer now, as though exhausted by its own transformation. In this moment, the room feels like a world suspended between eras. The alchemist is neither entirely medieval nor entirely timeless. He is simply human, curious, hopeful, stubborn. He has lived through a life marked by uncertainty, witnessed cities tremble under plagues and famine, listened to priests warn of judgment, watched rulers demand gold, and endured neighbors' suspicious glances. Yet through it all, he has tended his fire, believing that somewhere within the changing colors of heated matter lies a key to understanding the shifting world. He reaches into the furnace with tongs and lifts the vessel, holding it up to the light. It glows faintly in the darkness, like an ember captured in glass. What has changed inside it? The script offers no answer. The substance remains a mystery, as much to us as to him. Instead, the scene lingers on his face, the mixture of fatigue, awe, and a faint, trembling hope. He knows this might be nothing more than another failed attempt. He knows years of work may dissolve with a single crack of the glass. And yet he also knows that his perseverance is, in itself, a form of creation. As he sets the vessel down, he places his hand briefly on the table, steadying himself. He does not smile, but his eyes soften. In the end, the furnace is only half the story. The other half resides in him the belief that the world is still open to change, that understanding is worth pursuing, even when it remains elusive. This quiet conviction, this refusal to surrender to despair or certainty, may be the closest thing he will ever have to the great work. The night deepens. The flame dwindles to a soft glow. The alchemist closes his notebook and sits beside the furnace, allowing the warmth to rest against his tired bones. Whether his experiment succeeded or failed, we cannot tell. The script leaves the question hanging, suspended like the faint smoke above the coals. What matters is that, he continued, that he believed possibility still lived in the dark. As the camera lingers on that dimly lit room, the narrator prepares to turn toward our world, bridging the centuries and inviting us to consider what resides in our own unfinished work. There is a moment, after the alchemist's room fades from sight, when the darkness feels strangely familiar. The glow of his furnace softens, dissolves, and for a breath it is replaced by the faint light of another source, your screen, the one you're staring at now. The narrator lets that parallel settle gently, almost without words at first. You sit alone in the quiet, the world outside dim, the hour uncertain. He sat alone too, waiting for the right moment, watching the light shift in his small chamber while the rest of his town slept. Centuries apart, you and he share a posture, a mood, and a question that refuses to leave you alone. It does not matter whether your light comes from a furnace or from pixels. It fills the darkness in the same way, a small circle of warmth in a world that feels too large to grasp. The alchemist leaned close to the fire, hoping the flames might reveal some hidden order. You leaned close to the screen, wondering if some new idea, some carefully woven story, might give shape to the thoughts you never say aloud. Both of you are drawn to the glow, not because it answers anything immediately, but because it suggests that answers might still exist. The narrator reminds you that the alchemist's experiments were slow. He could wait hours for a vessel to cool, or for a mixture to shift from one color to another. He learned to live inside long stretches of uncertainty. You, in your way, do something similar each night when you wander through videos, theories, images, and possibilities. You move from idea to idea, gathering fragments, letting them settle in your mind. It is not fire you're tending, but something quieter, a searching that never fully stops, even when your body grows tired. Our experiments today look different, but the impulse behind them has barely changed. We test narratives, sift through information, compare one explanation to another, trying to find a pattern that fits how we feel inside. Instead of metal, we refine meaning. Instead of smoke, we watch for a flicker of insight. Instead of crucibles and sealed vessels, we have memory, instinct, and an endless river of stories that flow through cables and wires into our hands. Yet the same quiet urgency hums beneath both practices, the desire to understand what kind of world we are living in and whether it could ever become something better. The narrator speaks slowly here, giving your thoughts room to stretch. It is easy, at this hour, to believe your searching has no purpose, that you are simply filling time, distracting yourself until sleep finally arrives. But he invites you to imagine something gentler and more generous. Consider that you, too, are performing a kind of alchemy. You take raw material fear, curiosity, memories, questions, and move them through the slow fire of reflection. You discard what feels false, you keep what glows. You test ideas against your own experience, and the ones that survive become part of you. In that sense, the furnace inside the medieval workshop and the quiet heat of your mind serve a similar role. The alchemist believed that patience itself was transformative. He waited for metals to surrender their impurities, for substances to reveal their hidden nature. You wait for understanding to emerge from your wandering thoughts. You wait for a moment when something clicks, and the world feels a little less chaotic. You wait for the feeling that you have uncovered a truth, not necessarily a grand one, but one that speaks directly to you. The narrator lets this parallel draw itself. You might feel it already, the soft connection threading the centuries together. And then comes the twist, delivered not sharply but with a whispering softness. The narrator suggests that your late-night curiosity is not a distraction at all. It is a continuation of the old work, the kind that took place in dim rooms lit by flames and dreams. You refine yourself the way the alchemist tried to refine matter. Each idea you encounter becomes an ingredient, each video a mixture to test, each quiet hour an opportunity to see what stays and what evaporates. You are not melting metals or distilling elixirs, but you are distilling something: thought, meaning, possibility. Sometimes what emerges is unsettling, sometimes it is hopeful, sometimes it leaves you more awake than before, but in every case, something inside you shifts, even if only slightly. The narrator asks you to consider that the great work of your life might not be a single discovery or a perfect solution. It might simply be the way you build meaning out of the fragments you find along the way. No flame is wasted, no question pointless, if it helps shape the world you carry inside you. The alchemist often felt he was on the edge of a revelation he could never quite reach. You may know that feeling, too, the sense that something just outside your grasp might change everything if you could hold on to it for a moment longer. He kept working despite that gap, not because he expected triumph, but because he refused to believe the world was finished. In your own quiet way, you refuse that as well. You keep searching. You keep listening. Some part of you believes that understanding is still possible. There is a dignity in that, the narrator says, especially at hours when the rest of the world seems to have let go. You are not alone in your restlessness. You are part of a lineage that stretches back through centuries, through forgotten manuscripts and extinguished furnaces, through men and women who believed that the world could still be shaped by attention and imagination. Your laboratory may be invisible, but it is no less real. It is built of curiosity, memory, and the soft, persistent glow of your mind, refusing to settle for simple answers. So the question the narrator leaves hanging is not whether the alchemist succeeded. It is whether you realize that the work he pursued did not end with him. The tools have changed. The symbols look different. But the desire remains the same. You are not merely passing time as the night drifts on. You are participating in the long, unfinished task of trying to understand the nature of this world and your place within it. And as soon as you see the parallel clearly, the story is ready to turn toward its final movement, placing the great work directly into your hands. There comes a moment near the end of any long journey when the path begins to quiet. The steps slow, the light softens. The questions that once pulled you forward so urgently begin to drift into gentler shapes, no longer asking for solutions, only for understanding. The narrator lets that moment arrive with almost no announcement, as if it has been waiting patiently for the right breath. You have traveled through ancient deserts, through monasteries lit by trembling candles, through ruined libraries, vanished laboratories, and workshops kept alive by stubborn faith. You have walked beside kings who hoped to command destiny, and beside nameless figures who worked alone for years, believing that the world might be more flexible than it appeared. All of that now settles around you like dust in a beam of light. The narrator invites you to pause, not to summarize everything you have heard, but to feel the strange thread that connects all of it. For thousands of years, people have carried a quiet suspicion that the world we see each day might not be the final version. Something about life feels unfinished, provisional, as if the whole thing could, under the right conditions, be melted down and cast again. Sometimes this suspicion was shaped into myths. Sometimes it was recorded in coded manuscripts. Sometimes it appeared in whispered theories passed between scattered thinkers. And sometimes it lingered as a barely spoken hope inside a lonely room, like the one we visited at the beginning. Now the narrator suggests something simple, that every era has people who believe the world can be reset, and every era has people who must decide how to respond to that belief. Some resist it, clinging tightly to what already exists. Others fear it, seeing in every disruption the shadow of collapse. And some, like the alchemist, stand somewhere in between, neither worshipping the world as it is, nor burning it down, but searching for a more graceful way to understand its cracks. Your own era is no different. You live in a time filled with screens and signals, but the underlying emotion is the same one that flickered inside medieval minds. Uncertainty about what is ending and what might begin. The narrator does not judge this. He simply acknowledges it as part of being human. We are creatures who build and rebuild stories about our future, who imagine disasters and rebirths, who dream of wiping the slate clean, even when we know we cannot escape ourselves so easily. And here the shift begins. The narrator turns gently from the world outside to the world within you. He asks not as a challenge, but as a quiet invitation what kind of reset you truly long for. Not the cosmic one that rearranges the stars or rewrites history, but the small, private one that lives in the corners of your life. The reset that happens when you decide to break a habit that exhausts you, or repair a relationship you've left drifting too long. The reset that begins when you realize your days have been repeating themselves, and that repetition is not inevitable. These resets are not dramatic or world-shaking. They rarely make noise. But they move your life in ways no alchemist's furnace ever could. The narrator lingers on this thought, allowing it to bloom slowly. Perhaps it is easier to dream of resetting the universe than it is to admit that we might need to reset ourselves. It is easier to imagine purifying the world than to confront the chaos inside our own minds and hearts. The alchemist understood this tension deeply, even if he never said it aloud. He believed that transforming matter could cleanse the soul, and maybe he hoped that by fixing metals he might fix something in himself. You may feel a similar pull, the desire to understand the outer world while quietly avoiding the inner one. The narrator does not criticize you for this. He simply notes that both impulses come from the same root, the wish to start again. And then, the final twist arrives, not as a shock, but as a soft turning of perspective. What if the universe does reset, but not in the way legends describe? What if the great, sweeping renewal is not a single catastrophic moment, but 1,000 small shifts made by thousands of people, a gesture of kindness that changes a relationship, a decision to rest instead of collapse, a new way of thinking that breaks an old cycle? These are not dramatic events. They do not alter the flow of history in a way historians will record, but they alter the flow of your world, and in that quiet space, something miraculous happens. Reality reshapes itself from the inside out. The narrator suggests that perhaps every night, like this, every late, quiet hour where someone sits alone with their thoughts, creates another tiny crack in the old version of the world. Another chance for something different to emerge. The alchemist believed he could melt matter and refine it. You melt ideas, fears, and memories. You refine the story you tell about who you are and who you might become. Each choice, small as it seems, is a kind of alchemical act, carried out with no witnesses except the glow of your screen and the steady pulse of your own attention. And so the journey returns to where it began. A dim room, a single figure, a fragile hope. But now the figure is not the alchemist. It is you. You are the one sitting in the half-light, surrounded by unanswered questions, feeling the pull of something larger than your daily routines. You do not need a crucible or ancient manuscripts to continue the great work. You only need the willingness to look at your life and decide which parts you wish to recast. No one will force you. No one will guide you. You hold the furnace now, small but steady, glowing softly in your hands. The narrator allows the silence to lengthen before offering a final thought. The story does not end here. It simply opens into your own choices, your own hours, your own quiet experiments in becoming someone slightly more aligned with the world you hope to live in. The furnace fades, the echoes dim, but a faint ember remains, not in any laboratory, but in you. The work continues, gently, patiently, invisibly, exactly as it always has.